She had to lean heavily on Rosamond's arm. And Maisry's filthy one, and it was slow going. But she made it past the huts and the steward's house, and the interested pigs, and into the courtyard. The stump of a big ash tree lay on the cobbles in front of the barn, its twisted roots catching the flakes of snow. She will have caught a death with her behavior, Lady Amory said. Gesturing to Maisry to open the heavy wooden door, she will no doubt have a relapse. It began to snow in earnest. Maisbury opened the door. It had a latch like the little door on the rat's cage. I should have let it go, Kevin thought. Scourge or not, I should have let it go. Lady Hermione motioned to Maisry, and she came back to take Kivrin's arm again. No, she said, and shrugged off her hand and Rosamond's, and walked alone and without help through the door and into the darkness inside. Transcript from the Doomsday Book, 18th of December 1320, Old Style. I think I have pneumonia. I tried to go find the drop, but I didn't make it, and I've had some sort of relapse or something. There's a stabbing pain under my ribs every time I take a breath, and when I cough, which is constantly. It feels like everything inside is breaking to pieces. I tried to sit up a while ago and was instantly bathed in sweat, and I think my temp is back up. Those are all symptoms Dr. Ahrens told me indicate pneumonia. Lady Eloise isn't back yet. Lady Amani put a horrible-smelling poultice on my chest, and then sent for the steward's wife. I thought she wanted to chide with her for usurping the manor. But when the steward's wife came, carrying her 6-month-old baby, Emmeline told her the wound has fevered her lungs. And the steward's wife looked at my temple, and then went out and came back without the baby, and with a bowl full of a bitter-tasting tea. It must have had willow bark or something in it, because my temp came down, and my ribs don't hurt quite so much. The steward's wife is thin and small, with a sharp face and ash-blonde hair. I think Lady Amani is probably right about her being the one to tempt the steward into sin. She came in wearing a fur-trimmed kerchief, with sleeves so long they nearly dragged on the floor, and her baby wrapped in a finely woven wool blanket, and she talks in an odd slurred accent that I think is an attempt to mimic the Lady of Miney's speech. The embryonic middle class, as Mr. Latimer would say, nouveau rich and waiting for its chance, which it will get in 30 years when the Black Death hits, and a third of the nobility is wiped out. Is this the lady was found in the woods? She asked Lady Hermione when she came in, and there wasn't any seeming modesty in her manner. She smiled at Amaryllis as if they were old chums, and came over to the bed. Lady Amaryllis said, managing to get impatience. Disdain and distaste all in one syllable. The steward's wife was oblivious. She came over to the bed and then stepped back, the first person to show any indication. They thought I might be contagious. Has she the something fever? The interpreter didn't catch the word, and I couldn't get it either because of her peculiar accent. Floronian Florentine, she has a wound to the head. Hermione said sharply, it has fevered her lungs. The steward's wife nodded. Father Roach told us how he and Garwin found her, in the woods. Amani stiffened at the familiar use of Garwin's name, and the steward's wife did catch that, and hurried out to brew up the willow bark. She even ducked about a Lady Amani when she left, the second time. Rosamond came in to sit with me after Armani left, I think. They've assigned her to keep me from trying to escape again. And I asked her if it was true that Father Roach had been with Garwin. When he found me, nay, she said, Garwin met Father Roach on the road, as he brought you here and left you to his care, that he might seek your attackers, but he found naught of them. And he and Father Roach brought you here. You need not worry over it. Garwin has brought your things to the manor. I don't remember Father Roach being there, except in the sick room, but if it's true. And Garwin didn't meet him too far from the drop. Maybe he knows where it is. Break. I have been thinking about what Lady Hermione said. The wound to her head has fevered her lungs, she said. "I don't think anyone here realizes I'm ill. They let the little girls in the sick room all the time, and none of them seemed the least afraid, except the steward's wife. And as soon as Lady Amani told her I had fevered lungs, she came up to the bed without any hesitation. But she was obviously worried about the possibility of my illnesses being contagious, and when I asked Rosamond why she hadn't gone with her mother to see the cotter, she said as if it was self-evident, "She forbade me to go, the cotter is ill. I don't think they know I have a disease. I didn't have any obvious marker symptoms, like pox or a rash, and I think they put my fever and delirium down to my injuries. The wounds often become infected. And there were frequent cases of blood poisoning. There would be no reason to keep the little girls away from an injured person, and none of them have caught it. It's been 5 days, and if it is a virus, the incubation period should only be 12 to 48 hours. Dr. Aarons told me the most contagious period is before there are any symptoms, so maybe I wasn't contagious by the time the little girls started coming in. Or maybe this is something they've all had already, and they're immune." The steward's wife asked if I had had the Florentine fever, and Mr. Gilchrist, convinced there was an influenza epidemic in 1320. "Maybe that's what I caught." It's afternoon. Rosamond is sitting in the window seat sewing. A piece of linen with dark red wool and black is asleep beside me. "I've been thinking about how you were right, Mr. Dunworthy. I wasn't prepared at all, and everything's completely different from the way I thought it would be. But you were wrong about it's not being like a fairy tale. Everywhere I look I see things from fairy tales. Anna's red cape and hood, and the rat's cage and bowls of porridge, and the village's huts of straw and sticks that a wolf could blow down without half trying. The bell tower looks like the one Rapunzel was imprisoned in, and Rosamond bending over her embroidery, with her dark hair and white cap and red cheeks. Looks for all the world like Snow White. Break. I think my fever is back up. I can smell smoke in the room. Lady Amani is praying, kneeling beside the bed with her book of hours. Rosamond told me they have sent for the steward's wife. Again, Lady Amani despises her. I must be truly ill for Armani to have sent for her. I wonder if they will send for the priest. If they do, I must ask him if he knows where Garwin found me. It's so hot in here. This part is not like a fairy tale at all. They only send for the priest when someone is dying, but probability says there was a 70% chance of dying of pneumonia in the 1300s. I hope he comes soon to tell me where the drop is. And hold my hand. Chapter 13. 2 more cases. Both students came in while Mary was interrogating Colin on how he had got through the perimeter. It was easy, Colin had said indignantly. They're trying to keep people from getting out, not getting in, and had been about to give the particulars. When the registrar came in, Mary had made Dunworthy accompany her to the casualties ward to see if he could identify them. "And you stay here," she had told Colin. "You've caused quite enough trouble for one night." Dunworthy didn't recognize either of the new cases, but it didn't matter. They were conscious and lucid, and were already giving the house officer the names of all their contacts when he and Mary got there. He took a good look at each of them and shook his head. They might have been part of that crowd on the high street, I can't tell. He said, "It's all right," she said. "You can go home if you like." "Well, I thought I'd wait and have my blood test," he said. "Oh, but that isn't till," she said, looking at her digital. "Good Lord, it's past 6. I'll just go up and check on Bettery," he said, "and then I'll be in the waiting room." Bettery was asleep, the nurse said. "I wouldn't wake him." "No, of course not," Dunworthy said, and went back down to the waiting room. Colin was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, digging in his duffel. "Where's Great Aunt Mary?" he asked. "She's a bit flaked at my showing up, isn't she? She thought you were safely back in London." Dunworthy said your mother told her. Your train had been stopped at Barton. It was. They made everyone get off and get on another train. Going back to London, and you got lost in the changeover. No, I overheard these people talking about the quarantine and how there was this terrible disease and everybody was going to die and everything. He stopped to rummage further in his duffel. He took out and replaced a large number of items. Vids in a pocket vid, and a pair of scuffed and dirty runners. He was obviously related to Mary, and I didn't want to be stuck with Eric and miss all the excitement. Eric, my mother's living. He pulled out a large red gobstopper, picked off a few bits of lint, and popped it in his mouth. It made a mump-like lump in his cheek. He is absolutely the most necrotic person in the world, he said around the gobstopper. He has his flat down in Kent, and there is absolutely nothing to do. So you got off the train at Barton. What did you do then walk to Oxford? He took the gobstopper out of his mouth. It was no longer red. It was a mottled bluish-green color. Colin looked critically at all sides of it and put it back in his mouth. Of course not, Barton's a long way from Oxford. I took a taxi. Of course, Dunworthy said. I told the driver. I was reporting the quarantine for my school paper, and I wanted to get vids of the blockade. I had my vid with me, you see, so it seemed a logical thing. He held up the pocket vidder to illustrate, and then stuffed it back in the duffel, and began digging again. Did he believe you? I think so. He did ask me which school I went to. But I just said, very offended, you should be able to tell. And he said St. Edward's, and I said of course. He must have believed me. He took me to the perimeter. Didn't he? And I was worried about what Kevin would do if no friendly traveler came along, Dunworthy thought. What did you do then? Give the police the same story? Colin pulled out a green wool jumper, folded it into a bundle, and laid it on top of the open duffel. Nope. When I thought about it, it was rather a lame story. I mean, what is there to take pictures of? After all, it's not like a fire, is it? So I just walked up to the guard, as if I was going to ask him something about the quarantine, and then just to the last, I dodged sideways and ducked under the barrier. Didn't they chase you? Of course, but not for more than a few streets. They're trying to keep people from getting out, not in. And then I walked about a while till I found a call box. Presumably, it had been pouring rain this entire time, but Colin hadn't mentioned it. And a collapsible umbrella wasn't among the items he'd rooted out of his bag. The hard part was finding Great Aunt Mary. He said he lay down with his head on the duffel. I went to her flat, but she wasn't there. I thought perhaps she was still at the tube station, waiting for me, but it was shut down. He sat up, rearranged the wool jumper, and lay back down. And then I thought, she's a doctor. She'd be at the infirmary. He sat up again, punched the duffel into a different shape, lay down, and closed his eyes. Dunworthy leaned back in the uncomfortable chair. Envying the young, Colin was probably nearly asleep already, not at all frightened or disturbed by his adventures. He had walked all over Oxford in the middle of the night. Or perhaps he had taken further taxis, or pulled a collapsible bicycle out of his duffel, all by himself in a freezing winter rain. And he wasn't even fazed by the adventure. Kevin was all right. If the village wasn't where it was supposed to be, she would walk until she found it, or take a taxi, or lie down somewhere, with her head on her folded-up cloak, and sleep the undauntable sleep of youth. Mary came in. Both of them went to a dance in Headington last night, she said, dropping her voice when she saw Colin. Berdry was there too, Dunworthy whispered back. I know one of them danced with him. They were there from 9 to 2, which puts it at from 25 to 30 hours, and well within a 48-hour incubation period, if Battery is the one who infected them. You don't think he did? I think it's more likely. All three of them were infected by the same person. Probably someone Berdry saw early in the evening, and the others later. A carrier. She shook her head. People don't usually carry mix of viruses without contracting the disease themselves. but he or she could have had only a mild manifestation, or have been ignoring the symptoms. Dunworthy thought of Badri, collapsing against the console, and wondered how it was possible to ignore one's symptoms, and if Mary went on. This person was in South Carolina 4 days ago. You'll have your link with the American virus, and you can stop worrying over Kevin. She wasn't at the dance in Headington, she said. Of course, the connection is more likely to be several links away. She frowned and Unworthy thought. Several links that haven't checked into hospital or even rung up a doctor. Several links who have all ignored their symptoms. Apparently Mary was thinking the same thing. These bell ringers of yours. When did they arrive in England? I don't know. But they only arrived in Oxford this afternoon, after Badri was at the net. Well, ask them anyway when they landed. Where they've been, whether any of them have been ill. One of them might have relations in Oxford and have come up early. You've no American undergraduates in college. No Montoya is an American. I hadn't thought of that, Mary said. How long has she been here all term? But she might have been in contact with someone visiting from America. I'll ask her when she comes in for her blood work, she said. I'd like you to question Bordra about any Americans. He knows. All students who have been to the States on exchange. He's asleep and so should you be. She said I didn't mean now. She patted his arm. There's no necessity of waiting till 7. I'll send someone in to take blood and BP, so you can go home to bed. She took Dunworthy's wrist and looked at the temp monitor. Any chills? Nope. Headache? Yes, that's because you're exhausted. She dropped his wrist. I'll send someone straight away. She looked at Colin stretched out on the floor. Colin will have to be tested as well. At least till we're certain it's droplet. Colin's mouth had fallen open, but the gobstopper was still firmly in place. In his cheek, Dunworthy wondered if he were likely to choke. What about your nephew, he said. Would you like me to take him back to burial with me? She looked immediately grateful. Would you? I hate to burden you with him, but I doubt I'll be home till we get this under control. She sighed, poor boy. I hope his Christmas won't be despoiled. I wouldn't worry too much about it, Dunworthy said. Well, I'm very grateful, Mary said, and I'll see to the tests immediately. She left. Colin sat up immediately. What sort of test? Colin asked. Does this mean I might get the virus? I sincerely hope not, Dunworthy said, thinking of Badri's flushed face. His labored breathing. But I might, Colin said. The chances are very slim, Dunworthy said, and I shouldn't worry about it. I'm not worried. He held out his arm. I think I'm getting a rash, he said eagerly, pointing to a freckle. That isn't a symptom of the virus, Dunworthy said. Collect your things. I'm taking you home with me after the tests. He gathered up his muffler and overcoat from the chairs. He draped them over. What are the symptoms then? Fever and difficulty breathing, Dunworthy said. Mary's shopping bag was on the floor, by Latimer's chair. He decided they'd best take it with them. The nurse came in carrying her blood work tray. I feel hot, Colin said. He clutched his throat dramatically. I can't breathe. The nurse took a startled step backward. Blinking her tray, Dunworthy grabbed Colin's arm. Don't be alarmed, he said to the nurse. It's only a case of gobstopper poisoning. Colin grinned and bared his arm fearlessly for the blood test, then stuffed the jumper into the duffel and pulled on his still damp jacket, while Dunworthy had his blood drawn. The nurse said, Dr. Aaron said you needn't wait for the results, and left. Dunworthy put on his overcoat, picked up Mary's shopping bag, and LED Colin down the corridor, and out through the casualties ward. He couldn't see Mary anywhere, but she had said they needn't wait, and he was suddenly so tired he couldn't stand. They went outside. It was just beginning to get light out, and still raining. Dunworthy hesitated under the hospital porch, wondering if he should ring for a taxi, but he had no desire to have Gilchrist show up for his test while they were waiting and have to hear his plans for sending Kevin to the Black Death and the Battle of Agincourt. He fished Mary's collapsible umbrella out of her bag and put it up. "Thank goodness you're still here," Montoya said, skidding up on a bicycle. "Spraying water, I need to find Basingham." So do we all, Dunworthy thought, wondering where she had been. During all those telephone conversations, she got off the bike, pushed it up the rack, and keyed the lock. His secretary said, "No one knows where he is. Can you believe that?" "Yes." Dunworthy said, "I've been trying most of today. Yesterday to reach him. He's on holiday somewhere in Scotland. No one knows exactly where. Fishing, according to his wife, at this time of year," she said. Who would go fishing in Scotland in December? Surely his wife knows where he is, or has a number where he can be reached or something. Dunworthy shook his head. "This is ridiculous. I go to all the trouble to get the National Health Board to grant me access to my dig. And Basingham's on vacation." She reached under a slick and brought out a sheaf of colored papers. "They agreed to give me a waiver if the head of history would sign an affidavit saying the dig was a project necessary and essential to the welfare of the university." How could he just go off like this without telling anybody? She slapped the papers against her leg, and raindrops flew everywhere. "I have to get this signed before the whole dig floats away. Where's Gilchrist? We should be here shortly for his blood tests." Dunworthy said, "If you manage to find Basingham, tell him he needs to come back immediately. Tell him we've got a quarantine here. We don't know where an historian is, and the tech is too ill to tell us." "Fishing," Montoya said disgustedly, heading for casualties. "If my dig is ruined, he's gonna have a lot to answer for." "Come along," Dunworthy said to Colin, anxious to be gone before anyone else showed up. He held the umbrella so it would cover Colin too, and then gave up. Colin walked rapidly ahead, managing to hit nearly every puddle, then dawdled behind to look at shop windows. There was no one on the streets, though. Whether that was from the quarantine or the early hour, Dunworthy couldn't tell. Perhaps they'll all be asleep, he thought, and we can sneak in and go straight to bed. I thought there'd be more going on, Colin said, sounding disappointed. Sirens and all that, and dead carts going through the streets calling. "Bring out your dead," Dunworthy said. "You should have gone with Kivrin. Quarantines in the Middle Ages were far more exciting than this one's likely to be, with only 4 cases, and a vaccine on its way from the States." "Who is this Kivrin person?" Colin asked. "Your daughter. She's my pupil. She's just gone to 1320. Time travel apocalyptic. They turned the corner of the Broad." "The Middle Ages," Colin said. "That's Napoleon, isn't it? Trafalgar and all that. It's the 100 Years' War," Dunworthy said, and Colin looked blank. What are they teaching children in the schools these days, he thought. Knights and ladies and castles. The Crusades. The Crusades are a bit earlier. That's where I'd want to go, the Crusades. They were at Belial's Gate. "Quiet now," Dunworthy said. "Everyone will be asleep." There was no one at the Porter's Gate, and no one in the front quadrangle. Lights were on in the hall, the bell ringers having breakfast probably. But there were no lights in the senior common room, and none in Salvin. If they could get up the stairs without seeing anyone, and without Collins suddenly announcing he was hungry, they might make it safely to his rooms. He said, turning back to caution Colin, who had stopped in the quad to take out his gobstopper and examine its color, which was now a purplish black. "We don't want to wake everyone." He set his finger to his lips, turned around and collided with a couple in the doorway. They were wearing rain slicks and embracing energetically, and the young man seemed oblivious to the collision, but the young woman pulled free and looked frightened. She had short red hair and was wearing a student nurse's uniform. Under her slick, the young man was William Gadsden. "Your behavior is inappropriate to both the time and the place," Dunworthy said sternly. "Public displays of affection are strictly forbidden. In college, it is also ill-advised. Since your mother may arrive at any moment, "My mother," he said, looking as dismayed as Dunworthy had when he saw her coming down the corridor with her valise. "Here in Oxford, what's she doing here? I thought there was a quarantine on. There is, but a mother's love knows no bounds. She's concerned about your health, as am I considering the circumstances." He frowned at William and the young woman who giggled. "I would suggest you escort your fellow perpetrator home, and then make preparations for your mother's arrival." "Preparations?" he said, looking truly stricken. "You mean she's staying? She has no alternative, I'm afraid. There's a quarantine on." Lights came on suddenly inside the staircase, and Finch emerged. "Thank goodness you're here, Mr. Dunworthy," he said. He had a sheaf of colored papers too, which he waved at Dunworthy. "National Health has just sent over another 30 detainees. I told them we hadn't any room, but they wouldn't listen, and I don't know what to do. We simply do not have the necessary supplies for all these people." "Lavatory paper," Dunworthy said. "Yes," Finch said, brandishing the papers. "And food stores. We went through half the eggs and bacon this morning." "Alone, eggs and bacon," Colin said. "Are there any left?" Finch looked inquiringly at Colin and then at Dunworthy. "He's Dr. Aaron's nephew," he said, and before Finch could start off again, "He'll stay in my rooms." "Well, good, because I simply cannot find space for another person. We have both been up all night." "Mr. Finch, so here's the list of supplies as of this morning." He handed Dunworthy a dampish blue paper. "As you can see, Mr. Finch, I appreciate your concern about the supplies, but surely this can wait until after. This is a list of your telephone calls, with the ones you need to return marked with asterisks. This is a list of your appointments. The vicar wishes you to be at St. Mary's at 6:15 tomorrow to rehearse the Christmas Eve service. I will return all these calls, but after I Dr. Aaron's telephone twice, she wanted to know what you found out about the bell ringers." Dunworthy gave up. "Assign the new detainees to Warren and Bisset. Free to a room. There are extra cots in the cellar of the hall." Finch opened his mouth to protest. "They'll simply have to put up with the paint smell." He handed Colin Mary's shopping bag and the umbrella. "That building over there with the lights on is the hall," he said, pointing at the door. "Go tell the scouts you want some breakfast, and then get one of them to let you into my rooms." He turned to William, who was doing something with his hands. "Under the student nurse's Rhineslick, Mr. Godson, find your accomplice a taxi, and then find the students who've been here during VAC and ask them whether they've been to the States in the past week or had contact with anyone who has. Make a list. You haven't been to the States recently, have you?" "No, sir," he said, removing his hands from the nurse. "I've been up a whole VAC reading Petrarch." "Oh yes, Petrarch," Dunworthy said. "Ask the students what they know about Badrid Chowdhury's activities from Monday on and question the staff. I need to know where he was and who he was with. I want the same sort of report on Kivrin Engel. Do a thorough job and refrain from further public displays of affection. And I'll arrange for your mother to be assigned a room as far from you as possible." "Thank you, sir," William said. "That would mean a great deal to me, sir. Now, Mr. Finch, if you'll tell me where I might find Miss Taylor." Finch handed him more sheets with the room assignments on them. But Miss Taylor wasn't there. She was in the junior common room with her bell ringers, and apparently the still unassigned detainees. One of them, an imposing woman in a fur coat, grabbed his arm as soon as he came in. "Are you in charge of this place?" she demanded. Clearly not, Dunworthy thought. "Yes," he said. "Well, what are you going to do about getting us some place to sleep? We've been up all night." "So have I, madam," Dunworthy said. Afraid that this was Miss Taylor, she had looked thinner and less dangerous on the telephone, but visuals could be deceiving, and the accent and the attitude were unmistakable. "You wouldn't be Miss Taylor." "I'm Miss Taylor," a woman in one of the wing chairs said, She stood up. She looked even thinner than she had on the telephone, and apparently less angry. "I spoke with you on the phone earlier," she said, and the way she said it, they might have had a pleasant chat about the intricacies of change. Ringing. "This is Miss Pontini Artner," she said, indicating the woman in the fur coat. Miss Pontini looked like she could yank Great Tom straight off its moorings. She had obviously not had any viruses lately. "If I could speak with you privately for a moment." "Miss Taylor," he led her out into the corridor. "Were you able to cancel your concert in Ely?" "Yes," she said, and Norwich, they were very understanding. She leaned forward anxiously. "Is it true it's cholera?" "Cholera," Dunworthy said blankly. One of the women who had been down at the station said it was cholera, that someone had brought it from India, and people were dropping like flies. It had apparently not been a good night's sleep, but fear that had worked the change in her manner. If he told her there were only 4 cases, she would very likely demand they be taken to Ellie. "The disease is apparently a myxovirus," he said carefully. "When did your group come to England?" Her eyes widened. "You think we're the ones who brought it?" "We haven't been to India. There's a possibility it is the same myxovirus as one reported in South Carolina." "Are any of your members from South Carolina?" "No," she said. "We're all from Colorado except Miss Pontini. She's from Wyoming, and none of us has been sick." "How long have you been in England?" 3 weeks. "We've been visiting all the traditional council chapters and doing handbell concerts. We rang a Boston treble bob at St. Catherine's and post office catters with 3 of the Barclay, Edmonds chapter ringers, but of course, neither of those was a new peal, a Chicago surprise minor." "And you all arrived in Oxford yesterday morning?" "Yes. None of your group came early to see the sights or visit friends?" "No," she said, sounding shocked. "We're on tour, Mr. Dunworthy, not on vacation. And you said that none of you had been ill." She shook her head. "We can't afford to get sick. There are only 6 of us. Thank you for your help," Dunworthy said, and sent her back down to the common room. He rang up Mary, who couldn't be found, left a message, and started down Fincher's asterisks. He rang up Andrews Jesus College, Mr. Basingami's secretary, and St. Mary's. Without getting through, he rang off, waited a 5-minute interval, and tried again. During one of the intervals, Mary phoned. "Why aren't you in bed yet?" she demanded. "You look exhausted." "I've been interrogating the bell ringers," he said. "They've been here in England for 3 weeks. None of them came to Oxford before yesterday afternoon, and none of them are ill. Do you want me to come back and question Boudreau?" "It won't do any good, I'm afraid. He's not coherent. I'm trying to get through to Jesus to see what they know of his comings and goings." "Good," she said. "Ask his landlady too, and get some sleep. I don't want you getting this." She paused. "We've got 6 more cases. Any from South Carolina?" "No," she said. "And none who couldn't have had contact with Bordier. So he's still the index case. Is Colin all right?" "He's having breakfast," he said. "He's all right, don't worry about him. He didn't get to bed until after 1:30 in the afternoon. It took him 2 hours to get through to all the starred names on Finch's list, and another hour to discover where Battery lived. His landlady wasn't at home, and when Dunworthy got back, Finch insisted on going over the complete inventory of supplies. Dunworthy finally got away from him by promising to telephone the NHS and demand additional lavatory paper. He let himself into his rooms. Colin had curled up on the window seat, his head on his pack and a crocheted lap robe over him. It didn't reach as far as his feet. Dunworthy took a blanket from the foot of the bed and covered him up and sat down in the Chesterfield opposite to take off his shoes. He was almost too tired to do that, though he knew he would regret it if he went to bed in his clothes. That was the province of the young and non-arthritic. Colin would wake refreshed, in spite of digging buttons and constricting sleeves. Kevin could wrap up in her thin white cloak and rest her head on a tree stump, none the worse for wear. But if he so much as omitted a pillow or left his shirt on, he would wake stiff and cramped. And if he sat here with his shoes in his hand, he would not get to bed at all. He heaved himself out of the chair, still holding the shoes, switched the light off, and went into the bedroom. He put on his pajamas and turned back the bed. It looked impossibly inviting. I shall be asleep before my head hits the pillow, he thought, taking off his spectacles. He got into bed and pulled the covers up. Before I've even switched off the light, he thought, and switched off the light. There was scarcely any light from the window. Only a dull gray, showing through the tangle of darker gray vines. The rain beat faintly against the leathery leaves. I should have drawn the curtains, he thought, but he was too tired to get up again. At least Kevin wouldn't have to contend with rain. It was the Little Ice Age. It would be snow if anything. The Contempts had slept huddled together by the hearth, until it had finally occurred to someone to invent the chimney and the fireplace. And that hadn't been extant in Oxfordshire till the mid-15th century, but Kevin wouldn't care. She would curl up like Colin and sleep the easy, the unappreciated sleep of the young. He wondered if it had stopped raining. He couldn't hear the patter of it on the window. Perhaps it had slowed to a drizzle, almost getting ready to rain again. It was so dark, and too early for the afternoon to be drawing in. He drew his hand out from under the covers and looked at the illuminated numbers on his digital. Only 2 o'clock. It will be 6 in the evening where Kivrin was. He needed to phone Andrews again when he woke up and have him read the fix, so they would know exactly where and when she was. Bedria told Gilchrist there was minimal slippage, that he double-checked the first year apprentice's coordinates, and they were correct, but he wanted to make certain. Gilchrist had taken no precautions, and even with precautions, things could go wrong. Today proved that. Mattery had had the full course of antivirals. Colin's mother had seen him safely onto the tube and given him extra money the first time Dunworthy had gone to London. He had almost not made it back, and they had taken endless precautions. It had been a simple there and back again. To test the on-site net, only 30 years. Dunworthy was to go through to Trafalgar Square, take the tube from Charing Cross to Paddington, and the 10:48 train to Oxford, where the main net would be open. They had allowed plenty of time. Checked and rechecked the net, researched the ABC and the tube schedules, double-checked the dates on the money, and when he had got to Charing Cross, the tube station was closed. The lights in the ticket kiosks had been off, and an iron gate had been pulled across the entrance. In front of the wooden turnstiles, he pulled the blankets up over his shoulder. Any number of things could have gone wrong, with the drop things no one had even thought of. It had probably never occurred to Colin's mother that Colin's train would be stopped at Barton. It had not occurred to any of them that Bardry would suddenly fall forward into the console. Mary's right, he thought. You're a dreadful streak of Mrs. Gadd's Denitus. Pivrin overcame any number of obstacles. To get to the Middle Ages, even if something goes wrong, she can handle it. Colin hadn't let a little thing like a quarantine stop him, and Dunworthy had made it safely back from London. He had banged on the shut gate and then run back up the stairs to read the signs again, thinking that perhaps he had come in the wrong way. He hadn't. He had looked for a clock. Perhaps there had been more slippage than the checks indicated, he thought, and the underground was shut down for the night. But the clock above the entrance said 9:15, accident. A disreputable-looking man in a filthy cap said, "They've shut down till they can get it cleaned up, but I must take the Bakerloo line." He stammered, but the man shuffled off. He stood there staring into the darkened station, unable to think what to do. He hadn't brought enough money for a taxi, and Paddington was all the way across London. He'd never make the 10:48. "Where you going, mate?" A young man with a black leather jacket and green hair, like a coxcomb, said. Dunworthy could scarcely understand him. Punker, he thought. The young man moved menacingly closer. "Paddington," he said, and it came out as little more than a squeak. The banker reached in his jacket pocket for what Dunworthy was sure was his switchblade. But he pulled out a laminated tube pass and began reading the map on the back. "You can get District or Circle from Embankment. Go down Craven Street and take a left." He had run the whole way. Certain the punker's gang would leap out at him and steal his historically accurate money at any moment, and when he got to Embankment, he had had no idea how to work the ticket machine. A woman with 2 toddlers had helped him, punching in the destination and amount for him, and showing him how to insert his ticket in the slot. He had made it to Paddington with time to spare. "Aren't there any nice people in the Middle Ages?" Kevin had asked him, and of course there were. Young men with switchblades and tube maps had existed in all ages. So had mothers and toddlers and misses, Gadsons and Latimers and Gilchrists. He rolled over onto his other side. "She will be perfectly all right," he said aloud but softly. "Chose not to wake Colin. The Middle Ages are no match for my best pupil." He pulled the blanket up over his shoulder and closed his eyes, thinking of the young man with the green coxcomb poring over the map, but the image that floated before him was of the Iron Gate, stretched between him and the turnstiles and the darkened station beyond. Transcript from the Doomsday Book, 19th of December 1320, Old Style. "I'm feeling better. I can go 3 or 4 careful breaths at a time without coughing, and I was actually hungry this morning, though not for the greasy porridge Mary brought me. I would kill for a plate of bacon and eggs and a bath. I am absolutely filthy. Nothing's been washed since I got here, except my forehead and the last 2 days. Lady Amani has glued poultices made of strips of linen, covered with a disgusting smelling paste to my chest. Between that, the intermittent sweats that I'm still having, and the bed which hasn't been changed since the 1200s, I positively reek. And my hair, short as it is crawling. I'm the cleanest person here. Dr. Ahrens was right in wanting to cauterize my nose. Everyone, even the little girls, smell terrible. And it's the dead of winter and freezing cold in here. I can't imagine what it must be like in August. They all have fleas. Lady Amani stops even in mid-prayer to scratch. And when Agnes pulled down her hose to show me her knee, there were red bites all up and down her leg. Eloise, Emily, and Rosamond have comparatively clean faces, but they don't wash their hands, even after emptying the chamber pot. And the idea of washing the dishes or changing the flock and the mattresses has yet to be invented. By rights, they should all have long since died of infection. But except for scurvy and a lot of bad teeth, everyone seems to be in good health. Even Inez's knee is healing nicely. She comes to show me the scab every day, and her silver buckle and her wooden knight. And poor overloved Blackie, she is a treasure trove of information. Most of it volunteered without my even asking. Rosamond is in her 13th year, which means she's 12, and the room they've been tending me in is her bower. It's hard to imagine she'll soon be of marriageable age, and thus has a private maiden's bower. But girls were frequently married at 14 and 15. In the 1300s, Eloise can scarcely have been older than that when she married. Agnes also told me she has 3 older brothers, all of whom stayed in Bath with their father. The bell in the southwest is Swindon. Agnes can name all the bells by the sound of their ringing. The distant one that always rings first is the Osney bell, the forerunner of Great Tom. The double bells are at Courcy, where Sir Blow lives, and the 2 closest are Whitney and Escott. That means I'm close to Skengate in location, and this could very well be Skengate. It has the ash trees, it's about the right size, and the church is in the right place. Miss Montoya may simply not have found the bell tower yet, Unfortunately, the name of the village is the one thing Agnes hasn't known. She didn't know where Garwin was. She told me he was out hunting my attackers. And when he finds them, he will slay them with his sword. Like that, she said, demonstrating with Blackie. I'm not certain. The things she tells me can always be depended upon. She told me King Edward is in France, and that Father Roach saw the devil. Dressed all in black and riding on a black stallion. This last is possible that Father Roach told her that, not that he saw the devil. The line between the spiritual world and the physical wasn't clearly drawn into the Renaissance, and the Contemps routinely saw visions of angels. The Last Judgment, the Virgin Mary, Lady Amaryllis complains constantly about how ignorant and illiterate and incompetent Father Roach is. She is still trying to convince Eloise to send Garwin to Osney to fetch a monk. When I asked her if she would send for him so he could pray with me, I decided that request couldn't possibly be considered overbold. She gave me a half-hour recital of how he had forgotten part of the Veneta, had blown the candles out instead of pinching them, so that much wax is wasted, and filled the servants' heads with superstitious prate, no doubt of the devil and his horse. Village-level priests in the 1300s were merely peasants who'd been taught the Mass by rote, and a smattering of Latin. Everyone smells about the same to me, but the nobility viewed their serfs as a different species altogether, and I'm sure it offends a minor aristocratic soul to have to tell her confession to this villain. He's no doubt as superstitious and illiterate as she claims, but he's not incompetent. He held my hand when I was dying. He told me not to be afraid, and I wasn't. Break. I'm feeling better by leaps and bounds. This afternoon I sat up for half an hour, and tonight I went downstairs for supper. Lady Alois brought me a brown wadmal kerchief and mustard-colored surcoat to wear, and a sort of kerchief to cover my chopped-off hair. Not a wimple and coiffed, so Eloise must still think I'm a maiden, in spite of all Emma's talk about adulteresses. I don't know if my clothes were inappropriate, or simply too nice to be worn for every day. Eloise didn't say anything. She and Hermione helped me dress. I wanted to ask if I could wash before I put my new clothes on, but I'm afraid of doing anything that will make Hermione more suspicious. She watched me fasten my points and tie my shoes, as it was, and kept a sharp eye on me all through dinner. I sat between the girls and shared a trencher with them. The steward was relegated to the very end of the table, and Mary was nowhere to be seen. According to Mr. Latimer, the parish priest ate at the Lord's table, but Lady Amani probably doesn't like Father Roche's table manners either. We had meat, I think venison and bread. The venison tasted of cinnamon, salt, and the lack of refrigeration, and the bread was stone hard, but it was better than porridge. And I don't think I made any mistakes, though I'm certain I must be making mistakes all the time, and that's why Lady Armani is so suspicious of me. My clothes, my hands, probably my sentence structure are slightly, or not so slightly off, and it all combines to make me seem foreign, peculiar, suspicious. Lady Eloise is too worried over her husband's trial to notice my mistakes, and the girls are too young. But Lady Hermione notices everything and is probably making a list, like the one she has for Father Roche. Thank goodness I didn't tell her I was Isabelle de Beauvoir. She'd have ridden to Yorkshire winter or no to catch me out. Gavin came in after dinner. Mary, who had finally slunk in with a scarlet ear and a wooden bowl of ale, had dragged the benches over to the hearth and put several logs of fat pine on the fire, and the women were sewing by its yellow light. Garwin stopped in front of the screens, obviously just in from a hard ride, and for a minute no one noticed him. Rosamond was brooding over her embroidery. Agnes was pushing her cart back and forth with a wooden knight in it, and Eloise was talking earnestly to Hermione about the cotter, who apparently isn't doing very well. The smoke from the fire was making my chest hurt. and I turned my head away from it, trying to keep from coughing, and saw him standing there looking at Eloise. After a moment, Agnes ran her cart into Hermione's foot, and Hermione told her she was the devil's own child, and Garwin came on into the hall. I lowered my eyes and prayed he would speak to me. He did, bowing on one knee in front of where I sat on the bench. "Good lady," he said, "I am glad to see you improved." I had no idea what, if anything, was appropriate to say. I ducked my head lower. He remained on one knee like a servitor. "I was told you remember naught of your attackers." "Lady Catherine, is it so?" "Yes," I murmured, "nor of your servants, where they might have fled." I shook my head, eyes still downcast. He turned toward Eloise. "I have news of the renegades. Lady Eloise, I have found their trail. There were many of them, and they had horses." I'd been afraid he was going to say it. "Caught some poor wood-gathering peasant and hanged him. I beg your leave to pursue them and avenge the lady," he said, looking at Alois. Alois looked uneasy, wary the way she had when he came before. "My husband bade us keep to this place till he comes," she said, "and he bade you stay with us to guard us. Nay, you have not supped." Lady Hermione said in a tone that closed the matter. Darwin stood up. "I thank you for your kindness, sir," I said rapidly. "I know it was you who found me in the woods." I took a breath and coughed. "I beg you, will you tell me the place you found me? Where it is?" I had tried to say too much too fast. I began to cough, gasped a deeper breath, and doubled over with the pain. By the time I got the coughing under control, Imani had set meat and cheese on the table for Garwin, and Eloise had gone back to her sewing. "So I still don't know anything." "No, that's not true. I know why Eloise looked so weary when he came in, and why he made up a tale about a band of renegades, and what that conversation about Daltrises was all about. I watched him standing there in the doorway, looking at Eloise, and I didn't need an interpreter to read his face. He's obviously in love with his lord's wife." Chapter 14. Dunworthy slept straight through till morning. "Your secretary wanted to wake you up, but I wouldn't let him," Colin said. "He said to give you these." He thrust a messy sheaf of papers at him. "What time is it?" Dunworthy said, sitting up stiffly in bed. 8:30, Colin said. "All the bell ringers and DTS are in hall, eating breakfast oatmeal." He made a gagging sound. It was absolutely necrotic. "Your Sacramento chap says we need to ration the eggs and bacon because of the quarantine." Almost 8 in the morning, Dunworthy asked, blinking nearsightedly at the window. It was as dark and dismal as when he had fallen asleep. "Good Lord, I was supposed to have gone back to hospital to question Bardry." "I know," Colin said. "Great Aunt Mary said to let you sleep, that you couldn't question him anyway, because they're running tests." She rang up, Dunworthy asked, groping blindly for spectacles on the bedstand. "I went over this morning to have my blood tested. Great Aunt Mary said to tell you. We only need to come once a day for our blood tests." He hooked his spectacles over his ears and looked at Colin. "Did she say whether they'd identified the virus?" Colin said, around a lump in his cheek. Dunworthy wondered if the gobstopper had been in his mouth all night, and if so, why it hadn't diminished in size. "She sent you the contacts chart." He handed the papers to him. "The lady we saw at the infirmary rang up. To the one on the bicycle. Montoya, yes. She wanted to know if you knew how to get in touch with Mr. Basingami's wife. I told her you'd bring her back." "When does the post come? Do you know the post?" Dunworthy said, looking through the stack. "My mother didn't have my presents brought in. Time to send them on the tube with me." Colin said she said she'd send them by post. "You don't think the quarantine will delay it, do you?" Some of the papers Colin had handed him were stuck together, no doubt, because of Colin's periodic examinations of his gobstopper, and most of them seemed to be not the contact charts, but assorted memoranda from Finch. One of the heating vents in Salvan was stuck shut. The National Health Service ordered all inhabitants of Oxford and environs to avoid contact with infected persons. Mrs. Basingham was in Torquay for Christmas. They were running very low on lavatory paper. Do you think it will delay it? Colin asked. Delay what, Dunworthy said the post. Colin said disgustedly, the quarantine won't delay it. Well, at what time is it supposed to come? 10, Dunworthy said. He sorted all the memoranda into one pile and opened a large manila envelope. It's usually a bit late at Christmas because of all the parcels and Christmas cards. The stapled sheets in the envelope weren't the contact charts either. They were William Gadsden's report on Bardry's and Kivrin's whereabouts, neatly typed and organized into the morning, afternoon, and evening of each day. It looked far neater than any essay he'd ever handed in. Amazing what a salutary influence a mother could have. I don't see why it should be. Carlin said, it's not as if it's people. Is it so it can't be contagious? Where does it come to the hall? What, the post? Porter's Lodge, Dunworthy said, reading the report on Bardelli. He had gone back to the net Tuesday afternoon. After he was at Balliol, Finch had spoken to him at 2 o'clock when he had asked where Mr. Dunworthy was, and again at a little before 3 when Bardelli had given him the note. At some time between 2 and 3, Johnny, a third-year student, had seen him cross the quad to the laboratory, apparently looking for someone. At 3, the porter at Brasenose had logged Bardray in. He had worked in the net until 7:30, and then gone back to his flat and dressed for the dance. Dunworthy phoned Latimer. When were you at the net Tuesday afternoon? He blinked bewilderedly at Dunworthy from the screen. Tuesday, he said, looking around as if he had mislaid something. Was that yesterday? The day before the drop, Dunworthy said. You went to the Bodleian in the afternoon. He nodded. She wanted to know how to say help me, for I have been set upon by thieves. Dunworthy assumed by she he meant Kevin. Did Kevin meet you at the Bodleian or at Brasenose? He put his hand to his chin, pondering. We had to work until late in the evening, deciding on the form of the pronouns, he said. The decay of pronominal inflections was advanced in the 1300s, but not complete. Did Kivrin come to the net to meet you? The net? Latimer said doubtfully. To the laboratory of Brasenose, Dunworthy snapped. Brasenose. The Christmas Eve service isn't at Brasenose. Is it a Christmas Eve service? The vicar said he wished me to read the benediction. Latimer said, is it being held at Brasenose? No. You met with Kevin Tuesday afternoon. To work on her speech. Where did you meet her? The word thieves was very difficult to translate. It derives from the Old English thief, but this was useless. The Christmas Eve service is at St. Mary, the Virgin's at 7, he said, and rang off. He phoned the porter at Brasenose, who was still decorating his tree, and made him look up Kevin in his log book. She hadn't been there Tuesday afternoon. He fed the contact charts into the console and entered the additions from William's report. Kevin hadn't seen Bardry Tuesday morning. She had been in infirmary and then with Dunworthy. Tuesday afternoon she'd been with Latema, and Bardry would have been gone to the dance in Headington before they left the Bodleian. Monday from 3 on, she was in infirmary, but there was still a gap between 12 and 2:30 on Monday, when she might have seen Bardry. He scanned the contact sheets they had filled out again. Montoir's was only a few lines long. She had filled in her contacts for Wednesday morning, but none for Monday and Tuesday, as she hadn't listed any information on Bardra. He wondered why, and then remembered. She had come in after Mary gave the instructions for filling up the forms. Perhaps Montoya had seen Bardry before Wednesday morning, or knew where he'd spent the gap between noon and 2:30 on Monday. When Miss Montoya phoned, did she tell you her telephone number? He asked Colin. There was no answer. He looked up Colin. He wasn't in the room nor in the sitting room, though his duffer was, its contents spread all over the carpet. Dunworthy looked up Montoya's number at Brasenose and rang it up, not expecting any answer. If she was still looking for Basingham, that meant She hadn't gotten permission to go out to the dig, and was doubtless at the NHS or the National Trust, badgering them to have it declared of irreplaceable value. He dressed and went across to the hall. Looking for Colin, it was still raining. The sky the same sodden gray as the paving stones and the bark on the beech trees. He hoped that the bell ringers and detainees had breakfasted early and gone back to their assigned rooms, but it was a fond hope. He could hear the high hubbub of female voices before he was halfway across the quad. "Thank goodness you're here, sir," Finch said, meeting him at the door. "The NHS just phoned. They want us to take 20 more detainees." "Tell them we can't," Dunworthy said, looking through the crowd. "We're under orders to avoid contact with infected persons. Have you seen Dr. Aaron's nephew?" "He was just here," Finch said, peering over the heads of the women, but Dunworthy had already spotted him. He was standing at the end of the table, where the bell ringers were sitting, buttering several pieces of toast. Dunworthy made his way to him when Miss Montoya telephoned. "Did she tell you where she might be reached?" "The one with the bicycle," Colin said, smearing marmalade on the buttered toast. "Yes." "No, she didn't." "Will you have breakfast, sir?" Finch said. "I'm afraid there aren't any bacon and eggs, and we're getting very low on marmalade." He glared at Colin. "But there's oatmeal and just tea," Dunworthy said. "She didn't mention where she was phoning from." "Do sit down," Miss Taylor said. "I've been wanting to speak to you about our Chicago surprise." "What exactly did Miss Montoya say?" Dunworthy said to Colin. Then nobody cared that her dig was being ruined, and an invaluable link with the past was being lost. And what sort of person went fishing in the middle of winter anyway? Colin said, scraping marmalade off the sides of the bowl. "We're nearly out of tea," Finch said, pouring Dunworthy a very pale cup. Dunworthy sat down. "Would you like some cocoa, Colin, or a glass of milk?" Dunworthy asked. "We're nearly out of milk." Finch said, "I don't need anything, thanks." Colin said, snapping the slices of toast jam sides together, "I'm just going to take these with me out to the gate, so I can wait for the post." The vicar telephoned, Finch said. "He said to tell you, you needn't be there, to go over the order of worship until 6:30. Are they still holding the Christmas Eve service?" Dunworthy said, "I shouldn't think anyone would come under the circumstances." He said the inter-church committee had voted to hold it regardless, Finch said, pouring 1/4 teaspoon of milk in the pallid tea and handing it to him. He said they felt carrying on as usual. "We'll help keep up morale. We're going to perform several pieces on the handbells." Miss Taylor said, "It's hardly a substitute for appeal." "Of course, but it's something. The priest from Holy Reformed is going to read from the Mass in time of pestilence," Dunworthy said. "That should help in keeping up morale." "Do I have to go?" Colin said. "He has no business going out in this weather." Mrs. Gadsden said, appearing like a harpy, with a large bowl of gray oatmeal. She set it in front of Colin. "Had no business being exposed to germs. In a drafty church, he can stay here with me during the church service." She pushed a chair up behind him. "Sit down and eat your oatmeal." Colin looked beseechingly at Dunworthy. "Colin, I left Miss Montoya's telephone number in my rooms." Dunworthy said, "Would you fetch it for me?" "Yes," Colin said, and was out of his chair like a shot when that child comes down with the Indian flu. Mrs. Gadsden said, "I hope you will remember that. You were the one who encouraged him in his poor eating habits. It is clear to me what led to this epidemic: poor nutrition and a complete lack of discipline. It's disgraceful the way this college is run. I asked to be put in with my son William, but instead, I've been assigned a room in another building altogether. And I'm afraid you'll have to take that up with Finch." Dunworthy said. He stood up and wrapped Colin's marmalade toast in a napkin. "I'm needed at the infirmary," he said, and escaped before Mrs. Gadsden could start off again. He went back to his rooms and rang up Andrews. The line was engaged. He rang up the dig, on the off chance that Montoya had obtained her quarantine waiver. But there was no answer. He rang up Andrews again. Amazingly enough, the line was free. It rang 3 times, and then switched to a message service. "This is Mr. Dunworthy," he said. He hesitated, and then gave the number of his rooms. "I need to speak with you immediately. It's important." He rang off, pocketed the disc, picked up his umbrella and Colin's toast, and walked out through the quad. Colin was huddling under the shelter of the gate, looking anxiously down the street towards Carfax. "I'm going to the infirmary to see my tech." "And your great-aunt," Dunworthy said, handing him the napkin-wrapped toast. "Would you like to go with me?" "No thanks." Colin said, "I don't want to miss the post." "Oh, for goodness sake, go and fetch your jacket so Mrs. Gadsden doesn't come out and begin haranguing you. The gallstone's already been." Colin said, "She tried to make me put on a muffler." "A muffler?" He gave another anxious look down the street. "I ignored her. I hadn't thought of that," Dunworthy said. "I shall be home in time for lunch. If you need anything, ask Fincham." Colin said, obviously not listening. Dunworthy wondered what his mother was sending that merited such devotion. Obviously not a muffler. He pulled his own muffler up around his neck and set off for infirmary through the rain. There were only a few people in the streets, and they kept out of each other's way. One woman stepping off the pavement altogether to avoid meeting Dunworthy, without the carillon banging away at it, came upon the midnight clear. One would have had no idea at all that it was Christmas Eve. No one carried gifts or holly. No one carried parcels at all. It was as if the quarantine had knocked the memory of Christmas out of their heads completely. Well, and hadn't it? He hadn't given a thought to shopping for gifts or a tree. He thought of Colin, huddled at Balliol's gate, and hoped his mother at least hadn't forgotten to send his gifts. On the way home, he'd stop and get Colin a small present, a toy or a vid or something. Something besides a muffler at the infirmary. He was hustled immediately into isolation and taken off to question the new cases. "It is essential we establish an American connection," Mary said. "There's been a snag at the WIC. There's no one on duty who can run a sequencing because of the holidays. They're supposed to be at full readiness at all times, of course, but apparently it's after Christmas that they usually get problems. Food poisoning and overindulgence masquerading as viruses. So they give time off before. At any rate, the CDC in Atlanta agreed to send the vaccine prototype to the WIC without a positive SIDIT, but they can't begin manufacturing without a definite connection." She led him down a corridor. "The cases are all following the profile of the South Carolina virus. High fever, body aches, secondary pulmonary complication. But unfortunately, that's not proof." She stopped outside a ward. "You didn't find any American connections for Barry, did you?" "No, but there are still a good many gaps." "Do you want me to question him as well?" She hesitated. "He's worse," Dunworthy said. "He's developed pneumonia. I don't know if he'll be able to tell you anything. His fever is still very high, which follows the profile. We have him on the antimicrobials and adjuvants, which the South Carolina virus responded to." She opened the door to the ward. "The chart lists all the cases which have come in. Ask the nurse on duty which bed they're in." She typed something into the console by the first bed. It lit up a chart, as branching and intertwined as the big beach in the quad. "You don't mind having Colin with you for another night, do you?" "I don't mind in the slightest." "Oh, good. I doubt very much I'll be able to get home before tomorrow. And I do worry about him staying alone in the flat." "I'm apparently the only one who does, however," she said angrily. "I finally got through to Derringer down in Kent, and she wasn't even concerned." "Oh, is there a quarantine on?" She said, "I've been so rushed. I haven't had time to catch the news." And then she proceeded to tell me all about her and her living's plans with a clear implication that she'd have had no time at all for Colin and was glad she was rid of him. There are times when I'm convinced she's not my niece. Did she send Colin's Christmas presents? Do you know he said she planned to send them by post? I'm certain. She's been far too rushed to remember to buy them, let alone send them. The last time Colin was with me for Christmas, his gifts didn't arrive till Epiphany. Oh, which reminds me. Do you know what's become of my shopping bag? It had my gifts for Colin in it. I've got it at burial, he said. Oh good, I didn't finish my shopping. But if you'd wrap up the muffler and the other things, he'll have something under the tree. Won't he? She stood up. If you find any possible connection, come tell me immediately. As you can see, we've already traced several of the secondaries to bury, but those may only be cross connections. And the real connection could be someone else. She left. And he sat down beside the bed of the woman of the lavender umbrella, Miss Breen. He said, I'm afraid I must ask you some questions. Her face was very red, and her breathing sounded like bad breath. But she answered his questions promptly and clearly. No, she hadn't been to America in the past month. No, she didn't know any Americans or anyone who'd been to America. But she had taken the tube up from London to shop for the day, at Blackwell's, you know. And she had been all over Oxford shopping, and then at the tube station. And there were at least 500 people she had contact with, who might be the connection Mary was looking for. It took him till past 2 to finish questioning the primaries and adding the contacts to the chart, none of which were the American connection. Though he had found out that 2 more of them had been to the dance in Headington, he went up to isolation though. He didn't have much hope of Bardees being able to answer his questions, but Bardees seemed improved. He was sleeping when Dunworthy came in. But when Dunworthy touched his hand, his eyes opened and focused on him. Mr. Dunworthy, he said. His voice was weak and hoarse. What are you doing here? Dunworthy sat down. How are you feeling? It's odd the things one dreams. I thought I had such a headache. I need to ask you some questions. Badri, do you remember who you saw at the dance you went to in Headington? There were so many people. He said and swallowed as if his throat hurt. I didn't know most of them. Do you remember who you danced with? Elizabeth, he said. And it came out a croak. Sisu somebody. I don't know her last name, he whispered. And Elizabeth Yakamoto, the grim-looking ward sister, came in. Time for your x-ray, she said, without looking at Bettery. You'll have to leave, Mr. Dunworthy. Could I have just a few more minutes? It's important, he asked. But she was already tapping keys on the console. He leaned over the bed. Audrey, when you got the fix, how much slippage was there? Mr. Dunworthy, the sister said insistently. Dunworthy ignored her. Was there more slippage than you expected? No, Driss said huskily. He put his hand to his throat. How much slippage was there? For hours, Bettery whispered, and Dunworthy let himself be ushered out. For hours, Kevin had gone through at 12:30. That would have put her there at 4:30, nearly sunset. But still enough light left to see where she was. Enough time to have walked to Sken Gate if necessary. He went to find Mary and give her the 2 names of the girls Bordery had danced with. Mary checked them against the list of new admissions. Neither of them were on it, and Mary told him he could go home and took his tongue and blood so he wouldn't have to come back. He was about to start home when they brought Sisu Fairchild in. He didn't make it home till nearly tea time. Colin wasn't at the gate nor in hall, where Finch was nearly out of sugar and butter. Where's Dr. Arden's nephew? Dunworthy asked him. He waited by the gate all morning. French said anxiously, counting over sugar cubes. The post didn't come till past 1, and then he went over to his great-aunt's flat to see if the parcels had been sent there. I gather they hadn't. He came back looking very glum. And then about half an hour ago, He said suddenly, "I've just thought of something," and shot out. Perhaps he thought of some other place. The parcels might have been sent to, but weren't Dunworthy thought. "What time do the shops close today?" he asked Finch. "Christmas Eve. Oh, they've already closed, sir. They always close early on Christmas Eve, and some of them closed at noon. Due to the lack of trade, I have a number of messages." "Sir, they'll have to wait," Dunworthy said, snatched up his umbrella, and went out again. Finch was right, the shops were all closed. He went down to Blackwell's, thinking they had surely stayed open, but they were shut up tight. They had already taken advantage of the selling points of the situation, though. In the window arranged, amid the snow-covered houses of the toy Victorian village, were self-help medical books, drug compendium, and a brightly colored paperback entitled "Laughing Your Way to Perfect Health." He finally found an open post office off the high, but it had only cigarettes, cheap sweets, and a rack of greeting cards. Nothing in the way of suitable gifts. For 12-year-old boys, he went out without buying anything, and then went back and purchased £1 worth of toffee, a gobstopper the size of a small asteroid, and several packets of a sweet that looked like soap, tablets. It wasn't much, but Mary had said she'd bought some other things. The other things turned out to be a pair of gray woolen socks, even grimmer than the muffler, and a vocabulary improvement vid. There were crackers at least, and sheets of wrapping paper. But a pair of socks and some toffee hardly made a Christmas. He looked around to study, trying to think what he had that might do. Colin had said apocalyptic when Dunworthy had told him Kivrin was in the Middle Ages. He pulled down the Age of Chivalry. It only had illustrations, no hollows, but it was the best he could do on short notice. He wrapped it and the rest of the presents, hastily changed his clothes, and hurried over to St. Mary the Virgin's in a downpour, ducking across the deserted courtyard of the Bodleian, and trying to avoid the spilling gutters. No one in their right mind would come out. In this last year the weather had been dry, and the church was still only half full. Kivrin had gone with him. She had stayed up for the vac to study, and he had found her in the Bodleian, and insisted on her coming to his sherry party, and then to church. "I shouldn't be doing this," she had said on the way to the church. "I should be doing research. Who can do it as some Mary Virgins? Built in 1139, and all just as it was in the Middle Ages, including the heating system. The inner church service is authentic too." I suppose she'd said. "I have no doubt that in spirit it is as well meant, and as fraught with foolishness as any medieval mass," he had said. He hurried down the narrow path next to Brasenose, and opened the door of St. Mary's. To a blast of hot air his spectacles steamed up. He stopped in an Arthex and wiped them on the tail of his muffler. But they clouded up again immediately. "The vicar's looking for you." Colin said he was wearing a jacket and shirt, and his hair was combed. He handed Dunworthy an order of service from a large stack he was holding. "I thought you were going to stay at home," Dunworthy said with Mrs. Gadsden. "What an acrobatic idea. Even church is better than that. So I told Miss Taylor I'd help carry the bells over, and the vicar put you to work," Dunworthy said, still trying to get his spectacles clear. "Have you had any business? Are you joking? The church is crammed." Dunworthy peered into the nave. The pews were already full, and folding chairs were being set up at the back. "Oh good, you're here," the vicar said, bustling over with an armful of hymnals. "Sorry about the heat, it's the furnace. The National Trust won't let us put in a new fused air, but it's nearly impossible to get parts for a fossil fuel. At the moment it's the thermostat that's gone wrong. The heat's either on or off." He fished his slips of paper out of his cassock pocket and looked at them. "You haven't seen Mr. Latimer yet, have you? He's supposed to read the benediction." Number Dunworthy said. I reminded him of the time. "Yes, well, last year he muddled things and arrived an hour early." He handed Dunworthy one of the slips of paper. Here's your scripture. It's from the King James. This year the Church of the Millennium insisted on it. But at least it's not the People's Common. Like last year, the King James may be archaic, but at least it's not criminal. The outside door opened and a knot of people, all taking down umbrellas and shaking out hats, came in were order of service by Colin and went into the nave. I knew we should have used Christ Church, the vicar said. What are they all doing here? Dunworthy said. Don't they realize we're in the midst of an epidemic? It's always this way, the vicar said. I remember the beginning of the pandemic. Largest collections ever taken, later on. You won't be able to get them out of their houses. But just now they want to huddle together for comfort. And it's exciting, the priest from Holy Reform said. He was wearing a black turtleneck, bags and a red and green plaid alb. One sees the same sort of thing during wartime. They come for the drama of the thing and spread the infection twice as fast, I should think, Dunworthy said. Hasn't anyone told them the virus is contagious? I intend, the vicar said. Your scripture comes directly after the bell ringers. It's been changed, Church of the Millennium again. Luke chapter 2 verse 1 through 19. He went off to distribute hymnals. Where's your pupil, Kevin Engel? The priest asked. I missed her at the Latin Mass this afternoon. She's in 1320, hopefully in the village of Skengate. Hopefully and out of the rain. Oh good, the priest said she's so wanted to go. And how lucky she's missing all this. Yes, Dunworthy said. I suppose I should read through the scripture at least. Once, he went into the nave. It was even hotter in there. And it smelled strongly of damp wool and damp stone. Laser candles flickered wanly in the windows and on the altar. The bell ringers were setting up to large tables in front of the altar and covering them with heavy red wool covers. Dunworthy stepped up to the lectern and opened the Bible to Luke. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. He read, the King James is archaic, he thought, and where Kevin is hasn't been written yet. He went back out to Colin. People continued to stream in. The priest from Holy Reformed and the Muslim imam went across to Oriel for more chairs, and the vicar fiddled with the thermostat on the furnace. I saved us to seats in the second row, Colin said. Do you know what Mrs. Gadsden did at tea? She threw my gobstopper away. She said it was covered with germs. I'm glad my mother's not like that. He straightened his stack of folded orders of service, which had shrunk considerably. I think what happened is, her presence couldn't get through. Because of the quarantine, you know I mean. They probably had to send provisions and things first. He straightened the already straight pile again. Very likely, Dunworthy said. When would you like to open your other gifts? Tonight or in the morning? Colin tried to look nonchalant. Christmas morning, please. He gave an order of service and a dazzling smile to a lady in a yellow slipper, while she snapped, snatching it out of his hand. I'm glad to see someone still got the Christmas spirit, even though there's a deadly epidemic on. Dunworthy went in and sat down. The vicar's attentions to the furnace didn't seem to have done any good. He took off his muffler and overcoat and draped them on the chair beside him. It had been freezing last year, extremely authentic. Kevin had whispered to him, and so was the scripture, around then. The politicos dumped a tax hike on the ratepayers. She'd said, quoting from the People's Common. She grinned at him. The Bible in the Middle Ages was in a language they didn't understand either. Colin came in and sat down on Dunworthy's coat and muffler. The priest from Holy Reformed stood up and wedged himself between the bell ringers, tables and the front of the altar. Let us pray, he said. There was a plump of kneeling pads on the stone floor, and everyone knelt. O God, who have sent this affliction among us, say to thy destroying angel, hold thy hand, and let not the land be made desolate, and destroy not every living soul. So much for morale, Dunworthy thought. as in those days, when the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel, and there died of the people from Dan to Bazan 70,000 men. So now we are in the midst of affliction, and we beseech thee, to take away the scourge of thy wrath from the faithful. The pipes of the ancient furnace began clanging, but it didn't seem to deter the priest. He went on for a good 5 minutes, mentioning a number of instances in which God had smitten the unrighteous and brought plagues among them, and then asked everyone to stand and sing God Rest the Merry Gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Montoya ducked in and sat down next to Colin. I have spent all day at the NHS, she whispered, trying to get them to give me a dispensation. They seem to think I intend to run around, spreading the virus. I told them I'd go straight to the deck, that there's no one out there to infect, but do you think they'd listen? She turned to Colin. If I do get the dispensation, I'm going to need volunteers to help me. How would you like to dig up bodies? He can't, Dunworthy said hastily. His great-aunt won't let him. He leaned across Colin and whispered, we're trying to determine Budrick and Howery's whereabouts on Monday afternoon. From noon till to 30 did you see him, S.H., the woman who had snapped at Colin said. Montoya shook her head. I was with Kivrin, going over the map and the layout of Skengate. She whispered back, where at the dig? No, at Brasenose. And Bordier wasn't there, he asked, but there was no reason for Bordier to have been at Brasenose. He hadn't asked Bordier to run the drop until he met with him at 2:30. No, Montoya whispered. Shh, the woman hissed. How long did you meet with Kivrin? From 10 till she had to go check into Infirmary 3. I think, Montoya whispered she. I've got to go read a prayer to the Great Spirit. Montoya whispered, standing up and starting along the row of chairs. She read her American Indian chant, after which the bell ringers, wearing white gloves and determined expressions, played O Christ, who interfaces with the world, which sounded a good deal like the banging of the pipes. They're absolutely necrotic, aren't they? Conan whispered behind his order of service. It's late 20th century atonal. Dunworthy whispered back, it's supposed to sound dreadful. When the bell ringers appeared to be finished, Dunworthy mounted the lectern and read the scripture. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus, that all the world should be taxed. Montoya stood up and edged her way past Colin to the side aisle and ducked out the door. He had wanted to ask her if she'd seen Bartery at all, on Monday or Tuesday, or knew of any Americans he might have had contact with. He could ask her tomorrow, when they went for their blood work. He had found out the most important thing, that Kevin hadn't seen Bartery on Monday afternoon. Montoya had said she was with her from 10 till 3, when she left for infirmary. By that time, Barry was already at Balliol meeting with him, and he hadn't come up from London until 12, so Barry couldn't possibly have exposed her. Angels said unto them, Fear not, for behold I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. No one seemed to be paying any attention. The woman who had snapped at Colin was wrestling her way out of her coat, and everyone else had already shed theirs, and were fanning themselves with their orders of service. He thought of Kivrin at the service last year, kneeling on the stone floor, gazing raptly intently at him while he read. She had not been listening either. She had been imagining Christmas Eve in 1320, when the scripture was in Latin, and candles flickered in the windows. I wonder if it's the way she imagined it, he thought, and then remembered. It wasn't Christmas Eve there where she was. It was still 2 weeks away. If she was really there, if she was all right. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. Dunworthy finished and went back to his seat. The Imam announced the times of the Christmas Day services at all the churches and read the NHS bulletin on avoiding contact with infected persons. The vicar began his sermon. There are those, he said, looking hard at the priest from Holy Reformed, who think that diseases are a punishment from God. And yet Christ spent his life healing the sick. And were he here, I have no doubt, he would cure those afflicted with this virus. Just as he cured the Samaritan leper and launched into a 10-minute lecture on how to protect oneself from influenza. He listed the symptoms and explained droplet transmission. Drink fluids and rest, he said, extending his hands out over the pulpit as if it were a benediction. And at the first sign of any of these symptoms, telephone your doctor. The bell ringers pulled on their white gloves again and accompanied the organ in Angels from the Realms of Glory, which actually sounded recognizable. The minister from the converted Unitarian Church mounted the pulpit. On this very night over 2,000 years ago, God sent his Son, his precious child, into our world. Could you imagine what kind of incredible love it must have taken to do that? On that night, Jesus left his heavenly home and went into a world full of dangers and diseases. The minister said he went as an ignorant and helpless babe, knowing nothing of the evil, of the treachery he would encounter. How could God have sent his only Son, his precious child, into such danger? The answer is love, or incompetence, Gunworthy muttered. Colin looked up from his examination of his gobstoppers and stares at him, and after he'd let him go, he worried about him every minute. Dunworthy thought, I wonder if he tried to stop it. It was love that sent Christ into the world, and love that made Christ willing, nay, eager to come. She's all right, he thought. The coordinates were correct. There were only 4 hours slippage. She wasn't exposed to the flu. She's safely in Skengate, with a rendezvous date determined, and her corridor already half full of observations. Healthy and excited, and blissfully unaware of all of this, he was sent into the world to help us in our trials and tribulations, the minister said. The vicar was signaling to Dunworthy. He leaned across Colin. I've just gotten word that Mr. Latimer's ill. The vicar whispered. He handed Dunworthy a folded sheet of paper. Will you read the benediction? A messenger from God, an emissary of love. The minister said and sat down. Dunworthy went to the lectern. Will you please rise for the benediction? He said, opening the sheet of paper and looking at it. O Lord, stay thy wrathful hand, it began. Dunworthy warded it up. Merciful Father, he said, protect those absent from us and bring them safely home. Transcript from the Doomsday Book, 20th of December 1320. I'm nearly completely well. My enhanced T cells, or the antivirals or something, must have finally kicked in. I can breathe in without its hurting. My cough's gone and I feel as though I could walk all the way to the drop. If I knew where it was, the cut on my forehead is healed too. Lady Eloise looked at it this morning and then went and got a mirror and had her examine it. It is a miracle, Eloise said delightedly. But Armani only looked suspicious. Next she decided I'm a witch. It has become immediately apparent that now, I'm not an invalid, I'm a problem. Besides Armani thinking I'm spying or stealing the spoons, there's the difficulty of who I am, what my status is, and how I should be treated, and Eloise doesn't have the time or the energy to deal with it. She has enough problems. Lord Guillaume isn't here. His privy is in love with her, and Christmas is coming. She's recruited half the village as servants and cooks, and they are out of a number of essential supplies that Armani insists they send to Oxford or Corsi for. Agnes adds to the problem by being underfoot and constantly running away from Maisie. You must send us a blow-it for a waiting woman, Armani said when they found her playing in the barn loft. And for sugar, we have none for the subtlety nor the sweetmeats. Eloise looked exasperated. My husband bade us. I will watch Agnes, I said, hoping the interpreter had translated waiting woman properly, and that the history vids had been right. And the position of children's nurse was sometimes filled by women of noble birth. Apparently it was. Eloise looked immediately grateful, and Hermione didn't glare any more than usual. So I'm in charge of Agnes and apparently Rosamond, who asked for help with her embroidery this morning. The advantages of being their nurse is that I can ask them all about their father and the village, and I can go out to the stable and the church and find the priest and Garwin. The disadvantage is that a good deal is being kept from the girls. Once already, Eloise stopped talking to Armani when Agnes and I came into the hall, and when I asked Rosamond why they had come here to stay, she said, "My father deems the air is healthier at Ashincott." This is the first time anyone has mentioned the name of the village. There isn't any Ashincott on the map, or in the Doomsday Book. I suppose there's a chance it could be another lost village with a population of 40. It could easily have died out in the Black Death or been absorbed by one of the nearby towns. But I still think it's Skengate. I asked the girls if they knew of a village named Skimgate, and Rosamond said she'd never heard of it, which doesn't prove anything since they're not from around here. But Agnes apparently asked Mercery, and she'd never heard of it either. The first written reference to the gate, which was actually a weir, was until 1360, and many of the Anglo-Saxon place names were replaced by Normanized ones, or named for their new owners, which bodes ill for Guillaume de Lorry, and for the trial he still has not returned from. Unless this is another village altogether, which bodes ill for me. Break. Garwin's feelings of courtly love for Eloise are apparently not disturbed by dalliances with the servants. I asked Agnes to take me out to the stable to see her pony, on the chance that Garwin would be there. He was in one of the boxes with Maisley, making less than courtly grunting noises. Maisley looked no more terrified than usual, and her hands were holding her skirts in a wad above her waist instead of clutching her ears. So it apparently wasn't rape. It wasn't l'amour courtois either. I had to hastily distract Agnes and get her out of the stable. So I told her I wanted to go across the green to see the bell tower. We went inside and looked at the heavy ropes. Father Roach rings the bell when someone dies. Agnes said if he does not, the devil will come and take their soul, and they cannot go to heaven, which I suppose is more of the superstitious prate that irritates Lady Miami. Agnes wanted to ring the bell, but I talked her into going into the church to find Father Roach instead. Father Roach wasn't there. Agnes told me that he was probably still with the cotter who dies, not though he has been shriven or was somewhere praying. Father Roach is wont to pray in the woods, she said, peering through the rude screen to the altar. The church is Norman, with a central aisle and sandstone pillars, and a flagged stone floor. The stained glass windows are very narrow and small, and of dark colors they let in almost no light. Halfway up the nave is a single tomb, which may be the one I worked on out at the dig. It has an effigy of a knight on the top, his arms in gauntlets crossed over his breast, and his sword at his side. The carving on the side says, Requiescat cum sanctus tuis in aeternum, may he rest with thy saints forever. The tomb at the dig had an inscription beginning, Requiescat, but that was all that had been excavated. When I was there, Agnes told me the tomb is her grandfather's, who died of a fever a long time ago, but it looks nearly new, and therefore very different from the dig's tomb. It has a number of decorations the dig's tomb didn't have, but they might simply have broken or worn off. Except for the tomb and a rough statue, the nave is completely empty. The contempt stood during church, so there aren't any pews, and the practice of filling the nave with monuments and memorials didn't take hold until the 1500s. A carved wooden rood screen, 12th century, separates the nave from the shadowy recesses of the chancel and the altar. Above it on either side of the crucifix are two crude paintings of the Last Judgment. One is of the faithful entering heaven, and the other of sinners being consigned to hell. But they seem nearly alike. Both are painted in garish reds and blues, and their expressions look equally dismayed. The altar's plain, covered with a white linen cloth, with two silver candelabra on either side of it. The badly carved statue is not, as I'd assumed, the Virgin. But St. Catherine of Alexandria, it has the full shortened body and large head of pre-Renaissance sculpture and an odd, squarish quiff that stops just below her ears. She stands with one arm around a doll-sized child and the other holding a wheel, a short yellowish candle, and 2 oil cressets. We're sitting on the floor in front of it. Lady Kevin, Father Roach says, "You are a saint," Agnes said when we went back outside. It was easy to see where the confusion had come in this time, and I wondered if she'd done the same thing. With the bell and the devil on the black horse, "I am named for St. Catherine of Alexandria." I said, "As you are named for St. Agnes, but we ourselves are not saints." She shook her head. "He says in the last days, God will send his saints to sinful men. He says when you pray, you speak in God's own tongue." I've tried to be careful about talking into the recorder to record my observations. Only when there's no one in the room, but I don't know about when I was ill. I remember that I kept asking him to help me and you to come and get me. And if Father Roach heard me speaking modern English, he could very well believe I was speaking in tongues. At least he thinks I'm a saint and not a witch, but Lady Amani was in the sick room too. I will have to be more careful. Break. I went out to the stable again, after making sure Macy was in the kitchen. But Garwin wasn't there, and neither was Gringolet. My boxes and the dismantled remains of the wagon were, though Garwin must have made a dozen trips to bring everything here. I looked through it all, and I can't find the casket. I'm hoping he missed it, and it's still by the road where I left it. If it is, it's probably completely buried in snow. But the sun is out today, and it's beginning to melt a little. Chapter 15. Kevin's recovery from pneumonia came so suddenly. She was convinced that something had happened. To finally activate her immune system, the pain in her chest abruptly went away, and the cut on her forehead disappeared as if by magic. Amani examined it suspiciously, as if she suspected Kivrin of faking her injury. And Kivrin was infinitely glad the wound hadn't been duped. "You must thank God that he has healed you on this Sabbath day," Imani said disapprovingly, and knelt beside the bed. She had been to Mass and was wearing her silver reliquary. She folded it between her palms like the quarter. Kevin thought and recited the Pater Noster, then pulled herself to her feet. "I wish I could have gone with you to the Mass," Kevin said. Emily sniffed. "I deemed you were too ill," she said with an insinuating emphasis on the word ill. "And it was but a poor Mass." She launched into a recital of Father Rococo's sins. He had read the Gospel before the Curie. His alb was stained with candle wax. He had forgotten part of the Confiteor Docs. Listening to his sins seemed to put her in a better mood, and when she finished, she patted Kevin's hand and said, "You are not yet fully healed. Stay you in bed yet another day." Gibrin did, using the time to record her observations onto the recorder describing the manor and the village, and everyone she'd met so far. The steward came with another bowl of his wife's bitter tea, a dark burly man who looked uncomfortable in his Sunday best, jerkin and a too elaborate silver belt, and a boy about Rosamond's age came in to tell Eloise that her Mari's forefoot was amiss. But the priest didn't come again. He has gone to shrive the cotter, Agnes told her. Agnes was continuing to be an excellent informant, answering all of Kivrin's questions readily, whether she knew the answers or not, and volunteering all sorts of information about the village and its occupants. Rosamond was quieter and very much concerned with appearing grown-up. "Agnes, it is childish to speak, so you must learn to keep a watch on your tongue," she said repeatedly, a comment that happily had no effect whatsoever on Agnes. Rosamond did talk about her brothers and her father, who has promised he will come to us for Christmas. Without fail, she obviously worshipped him and missed him. "I wish I had been a boy," she said, when Agnes was showing Kivrin the silver penny Sir Blowhard had given her. "Then I had stayed with father in Bath, between the two girls. and snatches of Eloise's and Amina's conversations. Plus her own observations, she was able to piece together a good deal about the village. It was smaller than probability had predicted. Skengate would be small even for a medieval village. Kevin guessed it contained no more than 40 people, including Lord Guillaume's family and the stewards. He had 5 children in addition to the baby. There were 2 shepherds and several farmers, but it was the poorest of all Guillaume's holdings. Imani said, complaining again about them having to spend Christmas there. The steward's wife was the resident social climber, and Mazur's family the local ne'er-do-wells. Kevin recorded everything, statistics and gossip, folding her hands in prayer whenever she had the chance. The snow that had started when they brought her back to the manor continued all that night and into the next afternoon, snowing nearly a foot the first day Kivrin was up. It rained and Kivrin hoped the rain would melt the snow, but it merely hardened the crust to ice. She was afraid she'd have no hope at all of recognizing the drop. Without the wagon and boxes there, she would have to get Garwin to show it to her. But that was easier said than done. He only came into the hall to eat or to ask Eloise something, and Imani was always there watching when he was. So she didn't dare approach him. Kevin began taking the girls on little excursions around the courtyard out into the village, in the hope that she might run into him. But he was not in the barn or the stable. Gringale was not there either. Gibrin wondered if he had gone after her attackers, in spite of Eloise's orders, but Rosamond said he was out hunting. He slays deer for the Christmas feast. Agnes said no one seemed to care where she took the little girls, or how long they were gone. Lady Eloise nodded distractedly when Kevin asked if she might take the little girls to the stable, and Lady Armani didn't even tell Agnes to fasten her cloak or wear her mittens. It was as if they had given the children over into Kivrin's care and then forgotten them. They were very busy with preparations for Christmas. Eloise had recruited every girl and old woman in the village and set them to baking and cooking. The 2 pigs were slaughtered, and over half the doves killed and plucked. The courtyard was full of feathers and the smell of baking bread. In the 1300s, Christmas had been a 2-week celebration, with feasting and games and dancing, but Kevin was surprised that Eloise was doing all this. Under the circumstances, she must be convinced Lord Guillaume would really come for Christmas. As he'd promised, Armani supervised the cleaning of the hall, complaining constantly about the poor conditions and the lack of decent help. This morning she had brought in the steward and another man to take down the heavy tables from the walls and set them onto trestles. She was supervising Mrs. Riley and a woman with the patchy white scars of scrofula on her neck, while they scrubbed the table with sand and heavy brushes. "There's no lavender," she said to Eloise, "and not enough new rushes for the floor. We shall have to make do with what we have." Then Eloise said, "We have no sugar for the subtlety either, and no cinnamon but Corsi. They are amply provided. He would welcome us." Kevin was putting on Agnes's boots, getting ready to take her out to see her pony. In the stable again, she looked up alarmed. "It is but a half-day's journey," Ermin said. "Lady of Volder's chaplain will likely say the Mass." And Kevin didn't hear the rest of it because Agnes said, "My pony's called Saracen." Kevin murmured, trying to hear the conversation. Christmas was a time when the nobility often went visiting. She should have thought of that before. They took their entire households and stayed for weeks, at least until Epiphany. If they went to Corsi, they might stay until long after the rendezvous. Father named him Saracen for that. "He has a heathen heart," Agnes said. "Sir Bloate will take it ill when he finds we have sat so near through Yule without a visit." Lady Amani said, "He will think the betrothal has gone amiss. We cannot go to court here for Yule." Rosamond said she had been sitting on the bench across from Kivrin and Agnes sewing. But now she stood up. My father promised, without fail, that he would come by Christmas. He will be ill-pleased to come and find us gone. Hermione turned and glared at Rosamond. You will be ill-pleased to find his daughters grown so wild they speak when they will, and meddle in matters that do not concern them. She turned back to Eloise, who was looking worried. My son would surely have the wit to seek us at Courcy. My husband bade us stay here and wait till he comes. Eloise said, he will be pleased that we have done his bidding. She went over to the hearth and picked up Rosamond's sewing, clearly putting an end to the conversation. But not for long, Kevin thought, watching Hermione. The old woman pursed her lips angrily and pointed at a spot on the table. The woman with the scrofular scars immediately moved to scrub it. Hermione wouldn't let it rest. She would bring it up again, putting forth argument after argument, why they should go to Subloit, who had sugar and rushes and cinnamon, and an educated chaplain to say the Christmas masses. Lady Amani was determined not to hear Mass from Father Roach, and Eloise was more and more worried all the time. She might suddenly decide to go to Courcy for help, or even back to Bath. Kevin had to find the drop. She tied the dangling strings of Inez's cap and pulled the hood of her cloak up over her head. I rode Sarsen every day in Bath. Agnes said I would. We could go riding here. I would take my hound dogs. Do not ride horses, Rosamond said. They run alongside. Agnes pooched her lip out stubbornly. Black is too little to run. Why can you not go riding here? Kevin said to head off a fight. There's none to accompany us, Rosamond said. In Bath, our nurse and one of Father's privates rode with us. One of Father's praise, Garwin, could accompany them, and she could not only ask him where the drop was, but have him show it to her. Darwin was here. She had seen him in the courtyard this morning, which was why she had suggested the trip to the stable. But having him ride with them was better. Emily came over to where Eloise was sitting. If we are to stay here, we must have game for the Christmas pie. Lady Eloise set aside her sewing and stood up. I will bid the steward and his eldest son go hunting, she said quietly. Then there will be no one to fetch the ivy and the holly. Father Roach goes out to gather it this day. Lady Eloise said, he gathers it for the church. Lady Amani said, will you have none in the hall then? We'll fetch it, Kivrin said. Eloise and Amani both turned to look at her mistake. Kivrin thought she had been so intent on finding a way to speak to Garwin, she had forgotten everything else. And now she had spoken without being spoken to, and meddled in matters that obviously didn't concern her. Lady Amani would be more convinced than ever that they should go to Courcy and get a proper nurse for the girls. I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn, good lady, she said, ducking her head. I know there is much to do, and there are few to do it. Agnes and Rosamond and I might easily ride into the woods to fetch the holly, Agnes said eagerly. I could ride. Soros and Aloy started to speak, but Hermione interrupted her. Have you no fear of the woods then, though you are only lately healed of your injuries? Mistake upon mistake. She was supposed to have been attacked and left for dead, and here she was, volunteering to take two little girls into the same woods. I didn't mean that we should go alone, Kevin said, hoping she wasn't making it worse. Agnes told me that she rode out with one of your husband's men to guard her. Agnes piped up. Garwin can ride with us, and my hound Blackie. Garwin is not here, Amani said, and then turned quickly back to the women, scrubbing the table in the silence that followed. Where has he gone? Eloise said quietly enough, but her cheeks had flushed a bright red. Hermione took Mazzari's rag away from her and began scrubbing at a spot on the table. He has undertaken an errand for me. You have sent him to Courcy, Alois said, and it was a statement, not a question. Hermione turned back to face her. It is not meet for us to be so close to Courcy, and yet send no greeting, he will say. We have cast him off, and we can ill afford in these times. To anger such a man as powerful as my husband. Bade us tell no one we were here, Eloise cut in. My son did not bid us to slight Sir Bloet, and lose him his goodwill now, when it may be sorely needed. What did you bid him say to Sir Bloet? I bade him deliver kind greetings. Amani said, twisting the rag in her hands. I bade him say, we would be glad to receive them for Christmas. She lifted her chin defiantly. We could do naught else with our two families. To be joined so soon in marriage. They will bring provisions for the Christmas feast, and servants. And Lady Evilda's chaplain to say the Mass, Aloysia asked coldly. Do they come here? Rosamond asked. She had stood up again, and her sewing had slid off her knees and onto the floor. Eloise and Amani looked at her blankly, as if they had forgotten there was anyone else in the hall. And then Eloise turned on Kivrin. Lady Catherine, she snapped. Were you not taking the children to gather greens? For the hall, we cannot go without Garwin, Agnes said. Father Roach can ride with you, Eloise said. Yes, good Lady Kevin said. She took Anna's hand to lead her from the room. Do they come here? Rosamond asked again, and her cheeks were nearly as red as her mother's. I know not, and Bessie said, go with your sister and Lady Catherine. I am to ride Saracen, Agnes said, and tore free of Kivrin's hand and ran out of the hall. Rosamond looked as if she were going to say something, and then went to get her cloak from the passage behind the screens. Masonry, Eloise said, the table looks well enough. Go and fetch the salt cellar and the silver platter from the chest in the loft. The woman with the scrofular scars scurried out of the room, and even Mazzini didn't dawdle. Going up the ladder, Kivrin pulled her cloak on and tied it hastily. Afraid Lady Amani would say something else about her being attacked, but neither of the wounds said anything. They stood, Amani still twisting the rag between her hands, obviously waiting for Kivrin and Rosamond to be gone. Thus Rosamond said, and then ran off after Agnes. Kivrin hurried after them. Garwin was gone, but she had permission to go into the woods, and transportation, and the priest to go with them. Rosamond had said Garwin had met him on the road when he was bringing her to the manor. Perhaps Garwin had taken him to the clearing. She practically ran across the courtyard to the stable, afraid that at the last minute, Eloise would call across the courtyard to her that she had changed her mind. Kevin was not well enough, and the woods were too dangerous. The girls had apparently had the same idea. Agnes was already on her pony, and Rosamond was cinching the girth on her mare's saddle. The pony wasn't a pony at all. It was a sturdy sorrel, scarcely smaller than Rosamond's mare, and Agnes looked impossibly high up on the high-backed saddle. The boy who had told Eloise about the mare's foot was holding the reins. Don't stand gawping, Cobb, Rosamond snapped at him. Saddle the roan for Lady Catherine. He obediently let go of the reins. Agnes leaned far forward to grab them. Not mother's mare, Rosamond said. The wrong son. We will ride to the church, Saracen, Agnes said, and tell Father Roach we would go with him, and then we will go riding. Saracen loves to go riding. She leaned much too far forward to pet the pony's cropped mane, and Kivrin had to keep herself from grabbing for her. She was obviously perfectly able to ride. Neither Rosamond nor the boy saddling Kevin's horse gave her a glance, but she looked so tiny perched up there in the saddle, with her soft-soled boot and the jerked-up stirrup, and she was no more capable of riding carefully than she was of walking slowly. Cobb saddled the roan, let it out, and then stood there waiting. Cobb, Rosamond said rudely. He bent down and made a step out of his linked hands. Rosamond stepped up on it and swung into the saddle. Do not stand there like a witless fool. Help Lady Catherine. He hurried awkwardly over to give Kevin a hand up. She hesitated, wondering what was wrong with Rosamond. She'd obviously been upset by the news that Garwin had gone to Sabredet's. Rosamond hadn't seemed to know anything about her father's trial, but perhaps she was aware of more than Kivrin or her mother and grandmother thought. A man as powerful as Sir Bloet Armani had said. And his goodwill may be sorely needed, perhaps Armani's. Invitation was not as self-serving as it seemed. Perhaps it meant Lord Guillaume was in even more trouble than Eloise imagined. And Rosamond, sitting quietly at her sewing, had figured that out. Cobb Rosamond snapped. Though he was clearly waiting for Kevin to mount. "Your dawdling will make us miss Father Roach." Kevin smiled reassuringly at Cobb and put her hands on the boy's shoulder. One of the first things Mr. Dunworthy had insisted on was riding lessons, and she had managed fairly well. The side saddle hadn't been introduced until the 1390s, which was a blessing, and medieval saddles had a high saddle. Bow and cantle, this saddle was even higher in the back than the one she'd learned on. But I'll probably be the one to fall off, not Agnes, she thought, looking at Agnes perched confidently on her pony. She wasn't even holding on, but was twisted around, messing with something in the saddle bag behind her. "Let us be gone," Rosamond said impatiently. "Sir Bloet says he will bring me a silver bridle chain for Saracen," she said, still fussing with the saddlebag. Agnes stopped dawdling and come. Rosamond said, "Sir Bloet says he will bring it when he comes at Easter." "Agnes," Rosamond said, "come. It is like to rain." "Nay, it will not," Agnes said unconcernedly. "So Bloet." Rosamond turned furiously on her sister. "Oh, and can you now suit the weather? You are not but a babe, a mewing babe." "Rosamond," Geoffrey said, "don't speak that way to your sister." She stepped up to Rosamond's mare and took hold of the loosely looped reins. "What's the matter, Rosamond? Is something troubling you?" Rosamond pulled the reins sharply. "Taught, only that we dawdle here while the babe prattles." Kevin let go of the reins, frowning, and let Cobb make a step of his laced fingers for her foot so she could mount. She had never seen Rosamond act like this. They rode out of the courtyard, past the now empty pig pens, and out onto the green. It was a leaden day with a low, blanketing layer of heavy clouds and no wind at all. Rosamond was right about it being like to rain. There was a damp, misty feeling to the cold air. She kicked her horse into a faster walk. The village was obviously getting ready for Christmas. Smoke was coming from every hut, and two men were at the far end of the green, chopping wood and throwing it onto an already huge pile. A large blackened chunk of meat, the goat, was roasting over a spit beside the steward's house. The steward's wife was in front, milking the bony cow Kevin had leaned against. The day she tried to find the drop, she and Mr. Dunworthy had had a fight over whether she needed to learn to milk. She had told him no cows were milked in winter in the 1300s, that the Contemps let them go dry and used goat's milk for cheese. She had also told him goats were not meat animals. "Agnes," Rosamond said furiously. Kevin looked up. Agnes had come to a stop and was twisted backward in her saddle again. She obediently moved forward again, but Rosamond said, "I will wait for you no longer, Nenny," and kicked her horse into a trot, scattering the chickens and practically running down a barefoot little girl with an armload of faggots. "Rosamond," Kevin called, but she was already out of earshot, and Kevin didn't want to leave Anna's side to go after her. "Is your sister angry over fetching the holly?" Kevin asked Agnes, knowing that wasn't it, but hoping Agnes would volunteer something else. "She is ever cross-grained," Agnes said. "Grandmother will be wroth that she rides so childishly." She trotted her pony decorously across the green, a model of maturity, nodding her head to the villagers. The little girl, Rosamond, had almost run down, stopped and stared at them, her mouth open. The steward's wife looked up as they passed and smiled, and then went on milking, but the men who were cutting wood took off their caps and bowed. They rode past the hut where Kevin had taken shelter. The day she tried to find the drop, the hut she had sat in, while Garwin was bringing her things back to the manor. "Agnes," Kevin said, "did Father Roach go with you when you went after the eulog?" Agnes said. "He had to bless it." "Oh," Kevin said, disappointed. She had hoped Perhaps he had gone with Garwin to fetch her things and knew where the drop was. "Did anyone help Garwin bring my things to the manor?" "Nay," Agnes said. And Kevin couldn't tell whether she really knew or not. "Garwin is very strong. He killed for wolves with his sword." That sounded unlikely, but so did his rescuing a maiden in the woods. And it was obvious he would do anything if he thought it would win him Eloise's love, even to dragging the wagon home single-handed. "Father Roach is strong," Agnes said. "Father Roach is gone." Rosamond said already off her horse. She had tied it to the lich gate and was standing in the churchyard, her hands on her hips. "Have you looked in the church?" Kevin asked. "Nay," Rosamond said sullenly, "but look how cold it grows. Father Roach would have more wit than to wait here till it snows. We will look in the church." Kevin said, dismounting and holding her arms to Agnes. "Come on, Agnes." "Nay," Agnes said, sounding almost as stubborn as her sister. "I would wait here with Saracen." She patted the pony's mane. "Saracen will be all right," Kevin said. She reached for the little girl and lifted her down. "Come on, we'll look in the church first." She took her hand and opened the latch gate to the churchyard. Agnes didn't protest, but she kept glancing anxiously over her shoulder at the horses. Saracen likes not to be left alone. Rosamond stopped in the middle of the churchyard and turned around, her hands on her hips. What are you hiding, you wicked girl? Did you steal apples and put them in your saddlebags?" "Number," Agnes said, alarmed, but Rosamond was already striding toward the pony. "Stay from there, it is not your pony," Agnes shouted. "It is mine." "Well, we won't have to go find the priest." Kevin thought, "If he's here, he'll come out to see what all the noise is." Rosamond was unbuckling the straps to the saddlebag. "Look," she said, and held up Agnes's puppy by the scruff of its neck. "Oh, Agnes," Kevin said. "You are a wicked girl," Rosamond said. "I should take it to the river and drown it." She turned in that direction. "Nay," Agnes wailed and ran to the lich gate. Rosamond immediately held the puppy up, out of Agnes's reach. "This has gone absolutely far enough." Kevin thought she stepped forward and took the puppy away from Rosamond. "Agnes, stop howling. Your sister won't hurt your puppy." The puppy scrabbled against Kevin's shoulder, trying to lick her cheek. "Agnes, hounds can't ride horses. Blackie wouldn't be able to breathe in your saddlebag." "I could carry him," Agnes said, but not very hopefully. "He wanted to ride my pony. He had a nice ride to the church," Kevin said firmly. "And he will have a nice ride back to the stable." Rosamond, take Blackie back to the stable. He was trying to bite her ear. She gave him to Rosamond, who took hold of the back of his neck. "It's just a baby, Agnes. It must go back to its mother now and sleep." "You are the baby, Agnes," Rosamond said so furiously. Kevin was not sure she trusted her to take the puppy back to put a hound upon a horse. "And now we must waste yet more time taking it back. I should be glad when I am grown and no longer have to do with babes." She mounted, still holding the puppy up by his neck, but once she was in her saddle, she wrapped him almost tenderly in the corner of her cloak and cupped him against her chest. She took the reins with her free hand and turned the horse. "Father Roach is surely gone by now," she said angrily, and galloped off. Bryn was afraid she was probably right. The rocket they had made had almost been enough to wake the dead under the wooden tombstones, but no one had appeared from the church. He had no doubt left before they arrived, and now was long gone. But Kivrin took Agnes's hand and led her into the church. "Rosamond is a wicked girl," Agnes said. Kevin felt inclined to agree with her, but she could hardly say that. And she didn't feel much like defending Rosamond, so she didn't say anything. "Nor am I a babe," Agnes said, looking up at Kivrin for confirmation. But there was nothing to say to that either. Kivrin pushed the heavy door open and stood looking into the church. There was no one there. It was dim almost to blackness in the nave, the gray day outside, sending no light at all through the narrow, stained glass windows. But the half-open door gave enough light to see It was empty. Mayhappy is in the chant's soul. Agnes said she squeezed past Kivrin into the dark nave, knelt crossed herself, and then looked impatiently back over her shoulder. At Kivrin, there was no one in the chancel either. She could see from there that there was no candle fit on the altar. But Agnes wasn't going to be satisfied till they had searched the whole church. Kivrin knelt and made her obeisance beside her, and they walked up to the rood screen. Through the near darkness, the candles in front of the statue of Saint Catherine had been extinguished. She could smell the sharp scent of tallow and smoke. She wondered if Father Roach had snuffed them out before he left. Fire would have been a huge problem, even in a stone church, and there were no votive dishes. For the candles to burn down safely in, Agnes went right up to the rood screen, pressed her face against the cutout wood, and called Father Roach. She turned around immediately and announced, "He isn't here, Lady Kevin Mayhap. He's in his house," she said, and ran out the priest's door. Jibrin was sure Agnes was not supposed to do that, but there was nothing to do but follow her across the churchyard. To the nearest house, it had to belong to the priest, because Agnes was already standing outside the door, yelling Father Roach, and of course the priest's house was next to the church, but Kivrin was still surprised. The house was as ramshackle as the hut she had rested in, and not much larger. The priest was supposed to get a tithe of everybody's crops and livestock, but there were no animals in the narrow yard except for a few straggly chickens and less than an armload of wood stacked out front. Agnes had started banging on the door, which looked as insubstantial as the hut's, and Kevin was afraid she'd knock it open and walk straight in, but before she could get to her, Agnes turned and said, "Mayhappy's in the bell tower." "No, I don't think so," Kevin said, taking Agnes's hand. So she didn't go tearing off through the churchyard. Again, they started walking back toward the lich gate. "Father Roach does not ring the bell again till Vespers. He might," Agnes said, cocking her head as if listening for it. Kevin listened too, but there was no sound, and she realized suddenly that the bell in the southwest had stopped. It had rung almost non-stop while she had the pneumonia, and she had heard it when she went out to the stable the second time looking for Garwin, but she didn't remember whether it had rung since then or not. "Heard you that, Lady Kivrin," Agnes said. She pulled her hand out of Kivrin's grasp and ran off, not toward the bell tower, but around the end of the church to the north side. "See you," she crowed, pointing at what she'd found. "He has not gone." It was the priest's white donkey, placidly pulling at the weeds. Sticking up through the snow, it had a rope bridle on, and several burlap bags over its back, obviously empty, obviously intended for the holly and ivy. "He is in the bell tower, I trow," Agnes said, and darted back the way she'd come. Kevin followed her around the church and into the churchyard, watching Agnes disappear into the tower. She waited, wondering where else they should look. Perhaps he was tending someone ill in one of the huts. She caught a flicker of movement through the church window, a light. Perhaps while they were looking at the donkey, he had come back. She pushed the priest's door open and looked inside. A candle had been lit in front of St. Catherine's statue. She could see its faint glow at the statue's feet. "Father Roach," she called softly. There was no answer. She stepped inside, letting the door shut behind her, and went over to the statue. The candle was set between the statue's block-like feet. St. Catherine's rough face and hair were in shadow, looming protectively over the small, adult figure who was supposed to be a little girl. She knelt and picked up the candle. It had just been lit. It hadn't even had time to melt. The tallow in the well around the wick. Kevin looked down the nave. She couldn't see anything, holding the candle. It lit the floor and St. Catherine's box-like wimple, and put the rest of the nave in total darkness. She took a few steps down the nave, still holding the candle. Father Roach, it was utterly silent in the church, the way it had been in the woods that day. When she came through, to silent, as if someone was there, standing beside the tomb or behind one of the pillars, waiting. Father Roach, she called clearly, "Are you there?" There was no answer. Only that hushed waiting silence. There wasn't anyone in the woods, she told herself, and took a few more steps forward into the gloom. There was no one beside the tomb. Amani's husband lay, with his hands folded across his breast, and his sword at his side, peaceful and silent. There was no one by the door either. She could see it now. In spite of the candle's blinding light, there was no one there. She could feel her heart pounding. The way it hid in the forest, so loud it could be covering up the sound of footsteps, or breathing of someone standing there waiting. She whirled around, the candle tracing a fiery trail in the air. As she turned, he was right behind her. The candle nearly went out. It bent flickering and then steadied, lighting his cutthroat's face from below, the way it had with the lantern. "What do you want?" Kevin said so breathlessly almost no sound came out. "How did you get in here?" The cutthroat didn't answer her. He simply stared at her the way he had in the clearing. "I didn't dream him," she thought frighteningly. He was there. He had intended what? To rob her, to rape her. And Garwin had frightened him off. She took a step backward. "I said, what do you want? Who are you?" She was speaking English. She could hear it echoing hollowly in the cold, stone space. Oh no. She thought, don't let the interpreter break down now. What are you doing here?" she said, forcing herself to speak more slowly, and heard her own voice saying, "What a wolda thu with a may." He put his hand out toward her. A huge hand, dirty and reddened, a cutthroat's hand. "As if you would touch her cropped hair." "Go away," she said. She stepped backward again and came up against the tomb. The candle went out. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you better go away." It was English again. But what difference did it make? He wanted to rob her, to kill her. And where was the priest, Father Roach? She cried desperately, "Father Roach." There was a sound at the door, a bang, and then a scrape of wood on stone. And Agnes pushed the door open. "There you are," she said happily. "I've looked everywhere for you." The cutthroat glanced at the door. "Agnes!" Kevin shouted, "Run!" The little girl froze, her hands still on the heavy door. "Get away from here!" Kevin shouted, and realized with horror that it was still English. What was the word for run? The cutthroat took another step toward Kivrin. She shrank back against the tomb. "Renee, flee, Agnes!" she cried, and then the door crashed shut, and Kivrin was running across the stone floor, and out the door after her, dropping the candle as she ran. Agnes was almost to the lich gate, but she stopped as soon as Kivrin was out the door, and ran back to her. "No!" Kivrin shouted, waving her on. "Run!" "Is it a Volf?" Agnes asked, wide-eyed. There was no time to explain or try to coax her to run. The men who had been cutting wood had disappeared. She scooped Agnes up in her arms and ran toward the horses. "There was a wicked man in the church," she said, setting Agnes on her pony. "A wicked man?" Agnes asked. Ignoring the reins Kevin was thrusting at her. "Was it one of those who set upon you in the woods?" "Yes," Kevin said, untying the reins. "You must ride as fast as you can to the manor house. Don't stop for anything." "I didn't see him." Agnes said she probably hadn't, coming in from outside. She wouldn't have been able to see anything in the church's gloom. "Was he the man who stole your goods and gear and cracked your skull?" "Yes," Kevin said. She reached for the reins and started to untie them. "Was the wicked man hiding in the tomb?" "What?" Kevin said. She couldn't get the stiff leather untied. She glanced anxiously back at the church door. "I saw you and Father Roach by the tomb. Was the wicked man hiding in grandfather's grave?" Chapter 16. Father Roach. The stiff reins came suddenly loose in Kevin's hands. "Father Roach, I went in the bell tower, but he wasn't there." "He was in the church," Agnes said. "Why was the wicked man hiding in grandfather's tomb?" Lady Kevin, Father Roach, but it couldn't be. Father Roach had given her the last rites. He had anointed her temples and the palms of her hands. Will the wicked man hurt Father Roach? Agnes asked. He couldn't be Father Roach. Father Roach had held her hand. He had told her not to be afraid. She tried to call up the face of the priest. He had leaned over her and asked her name, but she hadn't been able to see his face because of all the smoke. And while he was giving her the last rites, she had seen the cutthroat. She had been afraid. Because they had let him in the room, she had tried to get away from him. But it hadn't been a cutthroat at all. It had been Father Roach. Is the wicked man coming? Agnes said, looking anxiously at the church door. It all made sense. The cutthroat. Leaning over her in the clearing, putting her on the horse. She had thought it was a vision from her delirium. But it wasn't. It had been Father Roach, come to help Garwin bring her to the manor. The wicked man isn't coming. Kevin said there isn't any wicked man. He's still in the church. No. I was wrong. There isn't any wicked man. Agnes looked unconvinced. You cried out, she said. Kevin could hear her telling her grandmother. Lady Catherine and Father Roach were in the church together. And she cried out. Lady Amani would be delighted to have this, to add to her litany of Father Roach's sins, and to Kevin's list of suspicious behavior. I know, I cried out, Kevin said. It was dark in the church. Father Roach came upon me suddenly, and I was frightened. But it was Father Roach, Agnes said, as if she couldn't imagine anyone being frightened by him when you and Rosamond play at hiding. And she jumps suddenly at you from behind a tree. You cry out, Kevin said desperately. One time Rosamond hid in the loft when I was looking at my hound. And she jumped down. I was so affrighted. I cried out like this, Agnes said, and let out a blood-curdling shriek. And another time, it was dark in the hall. And Garwin jumped out from behind the screens. And he said, Fi, and I cried out, and that's right. Kevin said, it was dark in the church. Did Father Roach jump out at you and say Fi? Yes, Kevin thought. He leaned over me, and I thought he was a cutthroat. No, she said, he didn't do anything. Go, we still with Father Roach for the holly. If I hadn't frightened him away, Kevin thought. If he hasn't left while we've stood here talking. She lifted Agnes down. Come on, we must go find him. She didn't know what she'd do if he'd already gone. She couldn't take Agnes back to the manor to tell Lady Amani how she had screamed. And she couldn't go back without explaining to Father Roach, explaining that she thought he was a robber, a rapist, that she thought he was a nightmare from her delirium. Must we go into the church again? Agnes asked reluctantly. It's all right, there's no one there except Father Roach. In spite of Kivrin's assurances, Agnes was unwilling to go back in the church. She hid her head in Kivrin's skirts. When Kivrin opened the door and clung to her leg, it's all right, Kevin said. Peering into the nave, he was no longer by the tomb. The door shut behind her, and she stood there with Agnes pressed against her, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. There's nothing to be afraid of. He's not a cutthroat, she told herself. There's nothing to be afraid of. He gave you the last rites. He held your hand. But her heart was pounding. Is the wicked man there? Agnes whispered, her head jammed against Kevin's knee. There isn't any wicked man, she said, and then saw him. He was standing in front of St. Catherine's statue. He was holding the candle Kevin had dropped, and he bent and set it in front of the statue, and then straightened again. She had thought perhaps it had been some trick of the darkness, and the candle's flame lighting his face from below. And he wasn't the cutthroat after all, but he was. He had worn a hood over his head that night, so she couldn't see his tonsure, but he was bending over the statue. The way he had bent over her, her heart began to pound again. Where's Father Roach? Agnes said, raising her head. There he is, she said, and ran toward him. No, Kevin said, and started after her. Don't, Father Roach. Agnes shouted, Father Roach. We've been seeking you. She had obviously forgotten all about the wicked man. We looked in the church and we looked in the house, but you weren't there. She was running full tilt at him. He turned and bent down and scooped Agnes up into his arms. All in one motion, I sought you in the bell tower. But you were not there, Agnes said. Without the slightest trace of fear, Rosamond said you'd gone. Kevin stopped even with the last pillar, trying to get her heart to slow. Down were you hiding, Agnes asked. She put one arm trustingly round his neck. Once Rosamond hid in the barn and jumped down on me. I cried out in a loud voice. Why did you seek me, Agnes? He said, is someone ill? He pronounced Agnes Agnes, and he had nearly the same accent. As the boy with the scurvy, the interpreter took a catch step before it translated what he'd said. And Kevin felt a fleeting surprise that she couldn't understand him. She had understood everything he'd said in the sick room. He must have been speaking Latin to me, she thought, but there was no mistaking his voice. It was the voice that had said the last rites, the voice that had told her not to be afraid. And she wasn't afraid at the sound of his voice. Her heart had stopped pounding. Nay, none are ill. Agnes said we would go with you together, Ivy and Holly for the hall. Lady Kivrin and Rosamond and Saracen, and I at the words Lady Kivrin. Roach turned and saw her standing there by the pillar. He sent Agnes down. Kivrin put out her hand to the pillar for support. I beg your pardon, Holy Father, she said. I'm so sorry. I screamed and ran from you. It was dark and I didn't recognize you. The interpreter still a half beat behind translated that as I knew you not. She knows not, Agnes interrupted. The wicked man struck her on the head, and she remembers not save for her name. I had heard this, he said, still looking at Kevin. Is it true? You have no memory of why you have come among us? She felt the same longing to tell him the truth that she had felt when he'd asked her. Her name, I'm an historian, she wanted to say. I came here to observe you and I fell ill, and I don't know where the drop is. She remembers not of who she is, Agnes said. She did not yet remember how to speak. I had to teach her. You remember not of who you are? He asked. No, and not of your coming here, he said. She could answer that truthfully, at least. No, she said. Except that you and Garwin brought me to the manor. Agnes was obviously tired of the conversation. Might we go with you now to gather holly? He didn't act as if he'd hurt her. He extended his hand as if he were going to bless Kevin, but he touched her temple instead. And she realized that was what he had intended to do before. Beside the tomb, you have no wound, he said. It's healed, she said. We wish to go now, Agnes said. Tugging on Roshi's arm, he raised his hand as if to touch her temple again, and then withdrew it. You must not fear, he said. God has sent you among us for some good purpose. No, he hasn't, Kevin thought. He hasn't sent me here at all. Medieval sent me, but she felt comforted. Thank you, she said. I would go now, Agnes said. Tugging on Kevin's arm, go fetch your donkey. She told Father Roach, and we will fetch Rosamond. Agnes started down the nave, and Kevin had no choice but to go with her, to keep her from running. The door banged open just before they reached it, and Rosamond looked in, blinking. It is raining. Found you, Father Roach, she demanded. Took you Blackie to the stable. Agnes asked. You were too late then, and Father Roach had gone. Nay is here, and we are to go with him. He was in the church, and Lady Kivrin. He has gone to fetch his donkey, Kivrin said to keep Agnes from launching into the story of what had happened. I was affrighted that time when you jumped from the loft, Rosamond, Agnes said. But Rosamond had already stomped off to her horse. It wasn't raining, but there was a fine mist in the air. Kevin helped Agnes into her saddle and mounted the sorrel using the latch gate as a step. Father Roach led the donkey out to them, and they started off on the track, past the church, and up through the little band of trees behind it, along a little space of snow-covered meadow, and on into the woods. There are wolves in these woods, Agnes said. Garwin killed one. Kevin scarcely heard her. She was watching Father Roche. walking beside his donkey, trying to remember the night. He had brought her to the manor. Rosamond had said Garwin had met him on the road, and he had helped Garwin bring her the rest of the way to the manor. But that couldn't be right. He had leaned over her. As she sat against the wagon wheel, she could see his face. In the flickering light from the fire, he had said something to her she didn't understand. And she had said, "Tell Mr. Dunworthy to come and get me." Rosamond does not ride in seemly fashion for a maid. Agnes said primly she had ridden out ahead of the donkey and was nearly out of sight where the road curved, waiting impatiently for them to catch up. Rosamond Kevin called, and Rosamond galloped back, nearly colliding with the donkey, and then pulling her mare's reins up short. "Can we go no faster than this?" she demanded, wheeled around and rode ahead again. "We will never finish ere it rains." They were riding in thick woods now, the road scarcely wider than a bridle path. Kevin looked at the trees, trying to remember having seen them. They passed a thicket of willows, but it was set too far back from the road, and a trickle of ice-bordered water ran next to it. There was a huge sycamore on the other side of the path. It stood in a little open space, draped with mistletoe. Beyond it was a line of wild service trees, so evenly spaced they might have been planted. She didn't remember ever having seen any of this before. They had brought her along this road, and she'd hoped that something might trigger her memory. But nothing looked familiar at all. It had been too dark, and she had been too ill. All she really remembered was the drop. Though it had the same hazy, unreal quality as the trip to the manor, there had been a clearing and an oak, and a thicket of willows, and Father Rocha's face, bending over her as she sat against the wagon wheel. He must have been with Garwin when he found her, or else Garwin had brought him back to the drop. She could see his face clearly in the light from the fire. And then she'd fallen off the horse at the fork. They hadn't come to any fork yet. She hadn't even seen any paths, though she knew they had to be there, cutting from village to village and leading to the fields. And the hut of the sick cotter Eloise had gone to sea. They climbed a low hill, and at the top of it, Father Roach looked back to see if they were following. He knows where the drop is, Kevin thought. She had hoped he had some idea where it was, that Garwin had described it to him, or told him which road it lay along, but he hadn't had to. Father Roach already knew where the drop was. He had been there. Agnes and Kevin came to the top of the hill, but all she could see was trees, and below them more trees. They had to be in Weeshwood Forest, but if they were, there were over 100 square kilometers in which the drop could be hidden. She would never have found it on her own. She could scarcely see 10 meters into the underbrush. She was amazed at the thickness of the woods as they came down the hill. Into the heart of them, there were clearly no paths between the trees here. There was scarcely any space at all, and what there was filled with fallen branches and tangled thickets and snow. She had been wrong about not recognizing anything. She knew these woods after all. It was the forest Snow White had got lost in. And Hansel and Gretel and all those princes, there were wolves in it, and bears, and perhaps even witches' cottages. And that was where all those stories had come from. Wasn't it the Middle Ages? And no wonder anyone would get lost in here. Roach stopped and stood beside his donkey, while Rosamond cantered back to him. And they caught up, and Kivrin wondered wryly if he had lost his way. But as soon as they came up to him, he plunged off through a thicket and onto an even narrower path that wasn't visible from the road. Rosamond couldn't pass. Father Roach and his donkey without shoving them aside, but she followed, nearly treading on the donkey's hind hooves. And Kivrin wondered again what was bothering her. Sir Blewett has many powerful friends. Lady Amani had said she had called him an ally, but Kivrin wondered if he really was, or if Rosamond's father had told her something about him that made her so distressed. At the prospect of his coming to Ashencourt, they went a short way along the path, past a thicket of willows that looked like the one by the drop, and then turned off the path, squeezing through a stand of firs, and emerging next to a holly tree. Kevin had been expecting holly bushes, like the ones in Braze's quad, but this was a tree. It towered over them, spreading out above the confines of the spruces. Its red berries, bright among the masses of glossy leaves. Father Roach began taking the sacks from the back of the donkey. Agnes attempting to help him, Rosamond pulled a short, fat, bladed knife out of her girdle and began hacking at the sharp-leaved lower branches. Kevin waded through the snow to the other side of the tree. She had caught a glimpse of white. She thought might be the stand of birches, but it was only a branch. Half fallen between two trees and covered with snow, Agnes appeared with Roach behind her. Carrying a wicked-looking dagger, Kevin had thought that knowing who he was would work some transformation, but he still looked like a cutthroat. Standing there looming over Agnes, he handed Agnes one of the coarse bags. "You must hold the bag open like this," he said, bending down to show her how. "The top of the bag should be folded back, and I will put the branches into it." He began chopping at the branches, oblivious to the spiky leaves. Kevin took the branches from him and put them in the bag carefully, so the stiff leaves wouldn't break. "Father Roach," she said, "I wanted to thank you for helping me when I was ill, and for bringing me to the manor when that you were fallen," he said, hacking at a stubborn branch. She had intended to say, "when I was set upon by thieves," and his response surprised her. She remembered falling off the horse and wondered if that was when he had happened along. But if it was, they had already come a long way from the drop, and he wouldn't know where it was. And she remembered him there at the drop. There was no point in speculating. "Do you know the place where Garwin found me?" she asked and held her breath. "Aye," he said, sawing at a thick branch. She felt suddenly sick with relief. He knew where the drop was. "Is it far from here?" "Nay," he said. He wrenched the branch off. "Would you take me there?" Kevin asked. "Why would you go there?" Agnes asked, spreading her arms out wide to keep the bag open. "What if the wicked men be still there?" Roach was looking at her, as if he were wondering the same thing. "I thought that if I saw the place, I might remember who I am and where I came from," she said. He handed her the branch, holding it so she could take it without being stabbed. "I will take you there," he said. "Thank you," Kevin said. "Thank you." She slid the branch in next to the others, and Roach tied the top shut and hoisted the bag over his shoulder. Rosamond appeared, dragging her bag in the snow behind her. "Are you not finished yet?" she said. Roach took her bag too and tied them on the donkey's back. Kivrin lifted Agnes onto her pony and helped Rosamond mount, and Father Roach knelt and linked his big hands so Kivrin could step up into the stirrup. He had helped her back on the white horse when she fell off, when she was fallen. She remembered his big hands steadying her, but they had come a long way from the drop by then. And why would Garwin have taken Roach all the way back to the drop? She did not remember going back, but it was also dim and confused. In her delirium, it must have seemed farther than it was. Roach led the donkey back through the firs and onto the path going back the way they had come. Rosamond let him get ahead and then said in a voice just like a man's, "Where goes he now? The ivy lies. Not this way. We go to see the place where Lady Catherine was set upon," Agnes said. Rosamond looked at Kivrin suspiciously. "Why would you go then?" she asked. "Your goods and gear have already been fetched to the manor. She wants that if she sees the place. She will remember somewhat," Agnes said. "Lady Kevin, if you remember who you are, must you return home?" "Certes she will," Rosamond said. "She must needs return to her family. She cannot stay with us forever. She was only doing this to provoke Agnes, and it worked. "She can," Agnes said. "She will be our nurse." Why would she wish to stay with such a mewing babe? Rosamond said, kicking her horse into a trot. "I am no babe," Agnes called after her. "You are the babe." She rode back to Kevin. "I do not wish you to leave me." "I won't leave you," she said. "Come, Father Roach is waiting." He was at the road, and as soon as they rode up, he started on. Rosamond was already far ahead, dashing along the snow-filled path, sending up sprays of snow. They crossed a little stream and came to a fork, the part they were on curving away to the right, the other continuing nearly straight for 100 meters or so, and then making a sharp jog to the left. Rosamond sat at the fork, letting her horse stamp and toss its head. To express her impatience, I fell off the white horse at a fork in the road. Kevin thought, trying to remember the trees, the road, the little stream, anything. There were dozens of forks along the paths that crisscrossed Weeshwood Forest, and no reason to think this was the one. But it apparently was. Father Roach turned right at the fork and went a few meters and then plunged into the woods, leading the donkey. There were no willows where he left the road, and no hill. He must be going back the way Garwin had brought her. She remembered them going a long way through the woods. Before they came to the fork, they followed him into the trees. Rosamond in the rear, and almost immediately had to dismount and lead their horses. Roach wasn't following any path that Kivrin could see. He picked his way through the snow, ducking under low branches that showered snow down on his neck, and skirting around a spiny clump of blackthorn. Kevin tried to memorize the scenery so she could find her way back here. But it all had a defeating sameness. As long as there was snow, she could follow their footprints and hoofprints. She would have to come back alone before it melted, and mark the trail with notches or scraps of cloth, or something, or breadcrumbs like Hansel and Gretel. It was easy to see how they, and Snow White and the princes, had got lost in the woods. They had only gone a few hundred meters, and already looking back. Kevin wasn't sure which direction the road lay. Even with the footprints, Hansel and Gretel could have wandered for months, and never found their way back home, or found the witch's cottage either. Father Roach's donkey stopped. "What is it?" Kevin asked. Father Roach led the donkey off to the side and tied it to an alder tree. "This is the place." It wasn't the drop. It was scarcely even a clearing, only a space where an oak tree had spread out its branches and kept the other trees from growing. It made almost a tent, and under it, the ground was only powdered with snow. "Can we build a fire?" Agnes asked, walking under the branches to the remains of a campfire. A fallen log had been dragged over to it. Agnes sat down on it. "I am cold," she said, poking at the blackened stones with her foot. It hadn't burned very long. The sticks were barely charred. Someone had kicked dirt on it to put it out. Father Roche had squatted in front of her, the light from the fire flickering on his face. "Well," Rosamond said impatiently. "Do you remember August? She had been here." She remembered the fire. She had thought they were lighting it for the stake, but that couldn't be right. Father Roach had been at the drop. She remembered him, leaning over her as she sat against the wagon wheel. "Are you sure this is the place where Garwin found me?" he said, frowning. "If the wicked man comes, I will fight him with my dirk," Agnes said, pulling one of the half-charred sticks out of the fire and brandishing it in the air. The blackened end broke off. Agnes squatted next to the fire and pulled out another stick, and then sat down on the ground, her back against the log, and struck the two sticks together. Pieces of charred wood flew off them. Kivrin looked at Agnes. She had sat against the log while they made the fire, and Garwin had leaned over her, his hair red in the fire's light, and said something to her that she couldn't understand. And then he had put the fire out, kicking it apart with his boots. and the smoke had come up and blinded her. "Have you remembered you?" Agnes said. Tossing the sticks back among the stones, Roach was still frowning at her. "Are you a Lady Catherine?" he asked. "No," she said, trying to smile. "It was just... I'd hoped that if I saw the place where I was attacked, I might remember." He looked at her solemnly a moment, the way he had in the church, and then turned and went over to his donkey. "Come," he said. "Have you remembered?" Agnes insisted, clapping her fur mitts together. They were covered with soot. Agnes, Rosamond said. "Look how you have dirtied your mittens." She pulled Agnes roughly to her feet. "And you have ruined your cloak sitting in the cold snow, you wicked girl." Kivrin pulled the two girls apart. "Rosamond, untie Inez's pony," she said. "It is time to go gather the ivy." She brushed the snow off Inez's cloak and wiped ineffectually at the white fur. Father Roach was standing by his donkey, waiting for them still with that odd sober expression. "We'll clean your mittens when we get home," she said hastily. "Come, we must go with Father Roach." Kevin took the Mari's reins and followed the girls and Father Roach back the way they had come, for a few meters, and then in another direction. That brought them almost immediately out onto a road. She couldn't see the fork, and she wondered if they were farther along the road, or on a different road altogether. It all looked the same. Willows and little clearings and oak trees. And it was clear what had happened. Garwin had tried to take her to the manor, but she had been too ill. She had fallen off his horse, and he had taken her into the woods and built a campfire and left her there, propped against the fallen log while he went for help. Or he had intended to build a fire and stay there with her until morning. And Father Roach had seen the campfire and come to help, and between them, they had taken her to the manor. Father Roach had no idea where the drop was. He had assumed Garwin had found her there, under the oak tree, the image of him leaning over her as she sat against the wagon wheel was part of her delirium. She had dreamed it as she lay in the sick room, the way she had dreamed. The bells and the stake and the white horse. "Where does he go now?" Rosamond asked peevishly, and Kevin felt like slapping her. "There is ivy nearer to home, and now it begins to rain." She was right, the mist was turning into a drizzle. We could have been finished and home ere now, if the babe Agnes had not brought her puppy. She galloped off her head again, and Kevin didn't even try to stop her. "Rosamond is a churl," Agnes said. "Yes," Kevin said, "she is. Do you know what's the matter with her?" "It is because of Sablert," Agnes said. "She is to wed him." What Kevin said. Imani had said something about a wedding, but she'd assumed one of Sablert's daughters was to marry one of Lord Guymon's sons. How can Sir Blewett marry Rosamond? Isn't he already married to Lady of Valder? "Nay," Agnes said, looking surprised. "Lady of Valder is Sir Blewett's sister." "But Rosamond isn't old enough," she said, and knew she was. Girls in the 1300s had frequently been betrothed before they were of age. Sometimes even at birth. Marriage in the Middle Ages had been a business arrangement, a way to join lands and enhance social standing. And Rosamond had no doubt been groomed from Inez's age to be married to someone like Sabert. But every medieval story of virginal girls married to toothless, dissipated old men came to her in a rush. "Does Rosamond like Sabert?" Kevin asked. Of course she didn't like him. She had been hateful, ill-tempered, nearly hysterical ever since she heard he was coming. "I like him," Agnes said. "He is to give me a silver bridal chain when they wed." Kevin looked ahead at Rosamond waiting far down the road. Sir Blurt might not be old and dissipated at all. She was assuming that, the way she had assumed Lady of Vald was his wife. He might be young, and Rosamond's bad temper might only be nervousness, or she might change her mind about him before the wedding. Girls weren't usually married till they were 14 or 15, certainly not before they started exhibiting signs of maturation. When are they to be married? Kevin asked Agnes at Eastertide. Agnes said they had come to another fork. This one was much narrower. The two roads running nearly parallel for 100 meters. Before the one Rosamond had taken started up a low hill. 12 years old and to be married in 3 months. No wonder Lady Eloise hadn't wanted to blow it. To know they were here, perhaps she didn't approve of Rosamond marrying so young. And the betrothal had only been arranged to get her father out of the trouble he was in. Rosamond rode to the top of the hill and galloped back to Father Roach. "Where do you lead us?" she demanded. "We come soon to open ground. We are nearly there." Father Roach said mildly. She wheeled her mare around and galloped out of sight. Over the hill reappeared, galloped back nearly to Kevin and Agnes, turned the mare sharply and rode ahead again. Like the rat in the trap, Kevin thought, frantically looking for a way out. The drizzle was turning into a sleety rain. Father Roach pulled his hood up over his tonsured head and led the donkey up the low hill. It plodded steadily up the incline to the top, and then stopped. Father Roach jerked on the reins, and the donkey pulled back against them. Kevin and Agnes caught up to him. "What's wrong?" Kevin asked. "Come, Balaam," Father Roach said, and took hold of the reins with both his huge hands. But the donkey didn't budge. It strained against the priest, digging in its rear hooves and leaning back, so it was nearly sitting mayhappy. "Like's not the rain," Agnes said. "Can we help?" Kevin asked. "Nay," he said, waving them past him. "Ride ahead. It will go better with him if the horses are not here." He wrapped the reins around his hand and went around behind. As if he intended to push, Kivrin rode over the crest with Agnes, looking back to make sure the donkey didn't suddenly kick him in the head. They started down the other side. The forest below them was veiled in rain. It was already melting the snow from the road, and the bottom of the hill was a muddy bog. There were thick bushes on either side, covered with snow. Rosamond sat at the top of the next hill. It had trees only halfway up its sides, and above them there was an expanse of snow, and beyond that, Kivrin thought, is an open plain and a view of the road and Oxford. "Where are you going, Kivrin?" "Wait," Agnes cried. But Kivrin was already down the hill and off, her sorrow shaking the snow-covered bushes. Trying to see if they were willows. They were, and beyond them she could see the crown of a big oak. She threw the sorrows, reins over the reddish willow branches, and pushed into the thicket. The snow had frozen the willow branches together. She struck at them and snow showered down on her. A flurry of birds launched itself into the air, screeching. She fought her way through the snowy branches and pushed through to the clearing that had to be. There it was, and there was the oak, and beyond it, away from the road, the stand of white-trunked birches that had looked like thinner woods. It had to be the drop, but it didn't look right. The clearing had been smaller, hadn't it? And the oak had had more leaves on it, more nests. There was a black thorn bush to one side of the clearing, its purple, black buds poking out from the vicious thorns. She didn't remember its being there. She would surely have remembered that, wouldn't she? It's the snow, she thought. It's making the clearing look larger. It was nearly half a meter deep here and smooth, untouched. It didn't look as if anyone had ever been here. "Is this the place where Father Roach would have us gather ivy?" Rosamond said, pushing through the thicket. She looked around the clearing, her hands on her hips. "There's no ivy here." There had been ivy, hadn't there? Wound around the base of the oak and mushrooms. It's the snow, she thought. The snow has covered up all the distinguishing landmarks and the tracks where Garwin had dragged away the wagon and the boxes. The casket. Garwin had not brought the casket back to the manor. He hadn't seen it because she'd hidden it in the weeds by the road. She pushed past Rosamond through the willows, not even trying to avoid the showering snow. The casket would be buried in snow too. But it wasn't as deep by the road. and the casket was nearly 40 centimeters tall. Lady Catherine Rosamond shouted right behind her. "Where would you now, Kevin?" Agnes said, a pathetic echo. She had tried to climb down off her pony in the middle of the road, but she had got her foot caught in the stirrup. "Lady Kevin, come you here." Kevin looked at her blindly for a moment, and then glanced up the hill. Father Roach was still at the top, struggling with the donkey. She had to find the casket before he came. "Stay on your pony, Agnes," she said, and began scrabbling at the snow under the willows. "What do you seek?" Rosamond said. "There's no ivy here." "Lady Kevin, you come now," Agnes said. Perhaps the snow had bent the willows over, and the casket was farther and underneath them. She bent over, clinging to the thin, brittle branches, and tried to sweep the snow aside. But the trunk wasn't there. She had seen that as soon as she started. The willows had protected the weeds and the ground. Underneath them, there were only a few centimeters of snow. But if this is the place, it must be here, Kevin thought numbly. If this is the place, Lady Kivrin, Agnes shouted, and Kivrin glanced back at her. She had managed to get down off her pony and was running toward Kivrin. "Don't run," Kevin started to say, but she didn't get it half out before Agnes caught her foot on one of the ruts and went down. It knocked the breath out of her, and Kivrin and Rosamond were both to her before she even started to cry. Kivrin scooped her into arms and pushed a hand against Agnes's middle to straighten her and make her take a breath. Agnes gasped, and then drew in a long breath and began to shriek. "Go and fetch Father Roach," Kevin said to Rosamond. "He's at the top of the hill." His donkey balked. "He is already coming," Rosamond said. Kivrin turned her head. He was running clumsily down the hill without the donkey, and Kivrin almost called out, "Don't run to him too." But he could not have heard her over Agnes's screaming. Kevin said, "You're all right. You just had the wind knocked out of you." Father Osh caught up to them, and Agnes immediately flung herself across. Into his arms, he hugged her against him. "Hush, Agnes," he murmured in his wonderful, comforting voice. "Hush." Her screams quieted to sobs. "Where did you hurt yourself?" Kevin asked, brushing the snow from Agnes's cloak. "Did you scrape your hands?" Father Roach turned her around in his arms so Kivrin could take her white fur mittens off her. Her hands were bright red, but they weren't scraped. "Where did you hurt yourself?" "She is not hurt," Rosamond said. "She cries because she is a babe." "I am not a babe," Agnes said, with such force she nearly flung herself out of Father Roach's arms. "I struck my knee on the ground." "Which one?" Kevin asked. "The one you hurt before." "Yes." "Do not look," she said, as Kevin reached for her leg. "All right, I won't," Kevin said. The knee had been scabbing over. She had probably knocked the scab loose, unless it was bleeding badly, enough to soak through her leather hose. There was no point in making her colder by undressing her here in the snow, but you must let me look at it at home. "Can we go thence now?" Agnes asked. Kevin looked helplessly across at the thicket. This had to be the place. The willows, the clearing, the treeless crest. It had to be the place. Perhaps she had put the casket farther back in the thicket than she thought. "And the snow. I would go home now," Agnes said, and began to sob. "I am cold." "All right," Kevin nodded. Agnes's mittens were too wet to put back on her. Kevin took off her borrowed gloves and gave them to her. They went all the way up Agnes's arms, which delighted her, and Kevin began to think she had forgotten about her knee. But when Father Roach tried to put her on her pony, she sobbed, "I would ride with you." Kevin nodded again and got on her sorrow. Father Roach handed Agnes up to her and led Agnes's pony up the hill. The donkey was standing at the top, by the side of the road, eating the weeds that poked up through the thin snow. Kevin looked back at the thicket through the rain, trying to see the clearing. "It's surely the drop," she told herself, but she wasn't sure. Even the hill looked somehow wrong from here. Father Roach took hold of the donkey's reins, and the donkey immediately stiffened and dug in its hooves. But as soon as Father Roach turned its head and started down the far side of the hill, with Anna's pony, it came willingly. The rain was melting the snow, and Rosamond's mare slipped a little. As she galloped on the straight stretch, back to the fork, she slowed it to a trot. At the next fork, Roach took the left-hand way. There were willows all along it, and oak trees, and muddy ruts at the bottom of every hill. "Do we go home now, Kevin?" Agnes said, shivering against her. "Yes," Kevin said. She pulled the tail of her cloak forward over Agnes. "Does your knee still hurt?" "Nay, we did not gather any ivy." She sat up straight and twisted around to look at Kevin. "Did you remember you when you saw the place?" "No," Kevin said. "Good," Agnes said, settling back against her. "Now you must stay with us forever." Chapter 17. Andrews did not telephone Dunworthy until late afternoon on Christmas Day. Colin had, of course, insisted on getting up at an ungodly hour to open his small pile of gifts. "Are you going to stay in bed all day?" he demanded while Dunworthy groped for his spectacles. "It's nearly 8 o'clock. It was in fact a 6:15 pitch black outside. Too dark even to see if it was still raining." Colin had had a good deal more sleep than he had. After the Eucharistic service, Dunworthy had sent Colin back to Belial and gone to infirmary to find out about Latimer. He has a fever but no lung involvement thus far. Mary had told him he came in at 5. Said he'd started feeling headachy and confused around 1:48 hours on the button. There's obviously no need to question him to find out who he contracted it from. "How are you feeling?" She had made him stay for blood tests, and then a new case had come in, and he'd waited to see if he could identify him. It was nearly 1 before he'd gone to bed. Colin handed Dunworthy a cracker and insisted he snap it, put on the yellow tissue paper crown, and read his motto aloud. It said, "When are Santa's reindeer most likely to come inside?" When the door is open, Colin was already wearing his red crown. He sat on the floor and opened his gifts. The soap tablets were a huge success, "See," Colin said. Sticking out his tongue, they turn in different colors. They did also his teeth and the edges of his lips. He seemed pleased with the book. Though it was obvious he wished there were hollows, he flipped through the pages, looking at the illustrations. "Look at this," he said, thrusting the volume at Dunworthy, who was still trying to wake up. It was a knight's tomb, with a standard carved effigy and full armor. On top, his face and posture, the image of eternal rest, but on the side in an inset frieze, like a window into the tomb. The dead knight's corpse struggled up in his coffin, his tattered flesh falling away from him like grave wrappings, his skeleton's hands curved into frantic claws, his face a skull's empty socketed horror. Worms crawled in and out between his legs, over and under his sword. Oxfordshire circa 1350, the caption read, "An example of the macabre tomb decoration, prevalent following the bubonic plague." "Isn't it apocalyptic?" Colin said delightedly. He was even polite about the muffler. "I suppose it's the thought that counts, isn't it?" he said, holding it up by one end, and then after a minute, "Perhaps I can wear it when I visit the sick." "They won't care what it looks like." "Visit what sick?" Dunworthy asked. Colin got up off the floor and went over to his duffel and began rummaging through it. "The vicar asked me last night if I'd run errands for him, check on people and take them medicine and things." He fished a paper bag out of the duffel. "This is your present," he said, handing it to Dunworthy. "It's not wrapped," he added unnecessarily. "Finch said we ought to save paper for the epidemic." Dunworthy opened the bag and pulled out a flattish red book. "It's an appointment calendar." Colin said. "It's so you can mark off the days till your girl gets back." He opened it to the first page. "See, I made sure to get one that had December." "Thank you," Dunworthy said, opening at Christmas. "The Slaughter of the Innocents." "New Year's Epiphany." "That was very thoughtful. I wanted to get you this model of Carfax Tower. That plays I heard the bells on Christmas Day," Colin said, "but it cost £20. The telephone rang. and Colin and Dunworthy both dived for it. "I bet it's my mother," Colin said. It was Mary calling from the infirmary. "How are you feeling?" Half asleep, Dunworthy said. Colin grinned at him. "How's Latimer?" Dunworthy asked. "Good," Mary said. She was still wearing her lab coat, but she'd combed her hair and she looked cheerful. "He seems to have a very mild case. We've established a connection with the South Carolina virus. Latimer was in South Carolina. No one of the students. I had your question last night. Good Lord, I mean. 2 nights ago I'm losing all track of time. One of the ones who'd been at the dance in Headington. He lied at first because he'd skipped off from his college to see a young woman and left a friend to cover for him. Skipped off to South Carolina, no London, but the young woman was from the States. She'd flown in from Texas and changed planes in Charleston, South Carolina. The CDC is working to find out what cases were in the airport. Let me speak to Colin. I want to wish him a happy Christmas." Dunworthy put him on, and he launched into a recital of his gifts, down to and including the motto in his cracker. "Mr. Dunworthy gave me a book about the Middle Ages." He held it up to the screen. "Did you know they cut off people's heads for stealing and stuck them up on London Bridge? Thank her for the muffler, and don't tell her. You're running errands for the vicar," Dunworthy whispered. But Colin was already holding the receiver out to him. "She wants to speak to you again. It's clear you're taking good care of him." Mary said, "I'm very grateful I haven't been home yet. And I should have hated him to be alone on Christmas. I don't suppose the promised gifts from his mother have arrived." Dunworthy said cautiously, looking at Colin, who was looking at the pictures in the Middle Ages book, nor telephoned. She said disgustedly, "The woman hasn't a drop of maternal blood in her body." For all she knows, Colin might be lying in hospital. With a temp of 40 degrees, mightn't he? "How's Madry?" Dunworthy asked. "The fever was down a bit this morning, but there's still a good deal of lung involvement. We're putting him on synthamycin. The South Carolina cases have responded very well to it." She promised to try to come over for Christmas dinner, and then rang off. Colin looked up from his book. "Did you know in the Middle Ages they burned people at the stake?" Mary didn't come nor telephone, and neither did Andrews. Dunworthy sent Colin over to Hall for breakfast and tried phoning the tech, but all the lines were engaged due to the holiday crush. The computer voice said obviously not reprogrammed since the beginning of the quarantine. It advised him to delay all non-essential calls until the next day. He tried twice more with the same result. Finch came over bearing a tray. "Are you all right, sir?" He said anxiously, "You're not feeling ill." "I'm not feeling ill. I'm waiting for a trunk call to come through." "Oh, thank goodness, sir. When you didn't come over for breakfast, I feared the worst." He took the rain-spotted cover off the tray. "I'm afraid it's a poor sort of Christmas breakfast, but we're nearly out of eggs. I don't know what sort of Christmas dinner it will be. There isn't a goose left inside the perimeter." It actually seemed to be quite a respectable breakfast. "A boiled egg, kippers, muffins with jam. I tried for a Christmas pudding, sir, but we're nearly out of brandy," Finch said, pulling a plastic envelope out from under the tray and handing it to Dunworthy. He opened it. On top was an NHS directive headed, "Early symptoms of influenza 1 disorientation. 2 headache, 3 muscle aches. Avoid contracting it. Wear your NHS regulation face mask at all times." Face mask? Dunworthy asked. "The NHS delivered them this morning," Finch said. "I don't know how we're going to manage the washing up. We're nearly out of soap." There were 4 other directives, all similar in tone, and a note from William Gadsden with a printout of Bardry's credit account for Monday, December 20th attached, but Dree had apparently spent that missing time from noon to 30 Christmas shopping. He had purchased 4 books, paperback at Blackwell's, a muffler red, and a digital Carillon miniature at Debenhams. Wonderful, that meant dozens and dozens more contacts. Colin came in carrying a napkin full of muffins. He was still wearing his paper crown, which was a good deal the worse for the rain. It would reassure everyone, Sir Finch said. If after your call comes through, you'd come over to Hall Mrs. Gadsden particularly is convinced you've come down with the virus. She said you'd contracted it through poor ventilation in the dormitories. I'll put in an appearance. Dunworthy promised. Finch went to the door and then turned back. About Mrs. Gadsden, sir, she's behaving dreadfully, criticizing the college and demanding that she be moved in with her son. She's completely undermining morale. I'll say, Colin said, dumping the muffins on the table. The Gowlstone told me hot breads were bad for my immune system. Isn't there some sort of volunteer work she could do? At infirmary or something? Finch asked to keep her out of college. We can hardly inflict her on poor, helpless flu victims. It might kill him. What about asking the vicar? He was looking for volunteers to run errands. The vicar, Colin said, have a heart. Mr. Dunworthy, I'm working for the vicar. The priest from Holy Reformed. Then Dunworthy said, he's fond of reciting the Mass in time of pestilence. For morale, they should get along swimmingly. I'll phone him straight away, Finch said and left. Dunworthy ate his breakfast except for the muffin, which Colin appropriated, and then took the empty tray over to Hall, leaving orders for Colin to come get him immediately. If the tech rang up, it was still raining, the trees black and dripping, and the Christmas tree lights spotted with rain. Everyone was still at table except for the bell ringers, who stood off to one side in their white gloves, their hand bells on the table in front of them. Finch was demonstrating the wearing of the NHS regulation masks, pulling off the tapes at either side and pressing them to his cheeks. You don't look well at all, Mr. Dunworthy, Mrs. Gadsden said, and no wonder. The conditions in this college are appalling. It's a wonder to me that there has not been an epidemic before this. Poor ventilation and an extremely uncooperative staff. Your Mr. Finch was quite rude to me when I spoke to him about moving into my son's rooms. He told me I had chosen to be in Oxford during a quarantine and that I had to take whatever accommodations I was given. Colin came skidding in. There's someone on the telephone for you, he said. Dunworthy started past her, but she placed herself solidly in his way. I told Mr. Finch that he might be content to stay at home when his son was in danger, but that I was not. I'm afraid I'm wanted on the telephone. Dunworthy said I told him no real mother could fail to go when her child was alone and ill in a faraway place. Mr. Dunworthy, Colin said, come along. Of course, you clearly have no idea what I'm talking about. Look at this child. She grabbed Colin by the arm, running about in the pouring rain with no coat on. Dunworthy took advantage of her shift in position to get past her. You obviously care nothing about your boys catching the Indian flu, she said. Colin wrenched free, letting him gorge himself on muffins and go about. Soaked to the skin, Dunworthy sprinted across the quad, Colin at his heels. I shall not be surprised if this virus turns out to have originated here. In Balliol, Mrs. Gadsden shouted after them. Sheer negligence, that's what it is, sheer negligence. Dunworthy burst into the room and snatched up the phone. There was no picture. Andrews, he shouted. Are you there? I can't see you. The telephone system's overbooked. Montoya said they've cut the visual. It's Lupe Montoya. Is Mr. Basingham? Salmon or trout? What? Dunworthy said, frowning at the blank screen. I've been calling fishing guides in Scotland all morning when I could get through. They say where he's gone. Depends on whether he's salmon or trout. What about friends? Is there someone in the university he goes fishing with? You might know. I don't know, Dunworthy said. Miss Montoya, I'm afraid I'm waiting for a most important. I've tried everything else, hotels, inns, boat rentals, even his barber. I tracked his wife down in Torquay, and she said he didn't tell her where he was going. I hope that doesn't mean he's off somewhere. With a woman and not really in Scotland at all. I hardly think Mr. Basingham, yes. Well, then why doesn't anyone know where he is? And why hasn't he called in? Now that the epidemic's all over the papers and the vids. Miss Montoya, I suppose. I'll have to call both the salmon and trout guides. I'll let you know if I find him. She rang off finally. And Downworthy put the receiver down and stared at it. Certain Andrews had tried to ring. While he was on the line with Montoya, didn't you say? There were a lot of epidemics in the Middle Ages, Carlin asked. He was sitting in the window seat. With the middle-aged man's book on his knees, eating muffins. Yes. Well, I can't find them in this book. How do you spell it? Try Black Death, Dunworthy said. Dunworthy waited an anxious quarter of an hour, and then tried to ring Andrews again. The lines were still jammed. Did you know the Black Death was in Oxford? Carlin said he had polished off the muffins and was back to the soap tablets at Christmas, just like us. Influenza scarcely compares with the plague, he said, watching the telephone as if he could will it to ring. The Black Death killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe. I know, Colin said, and the plague was a lot more interesting. It was spread by rats, and you got these enormous buboes under your arms, and they turned black and swelled up till they were enormous, and then you died. The flu doesn't have anything like that, he said, sounding disappointed. No, and the flu is only one disease. There were 3 sorts of plague. Bubonic, that's the one with the buboes. Pneumonic, he said, pronouncing the P. It went in your lungs, and you coughed up blood. And septic, which went into your bloodstream and killed you in 3 hours, and your body turned black all over. Isn't that apocalyptic? Yes, Dunworthy said. The telephone rang just after 11 o'clock, and Dunworthy snatched it up again. But it was Mary, saying she wouldn't be able to manage dinner. We've had 5 new cases this morning. We'll come to infirmary as soon as my trunk call has come through, Dunworthy promised. I'm waiting for one of my techs to phone. I'm going to have him come and read the fix. Mary looked weary. Have you cleared this with Gilchrist? Gilchrist. He's busy planning to send Kirov to the Black Death. Nevertheless, I don't think you should do this without telling him. He is acting head, and there's no point in antagonizing him. If something has gone wrong, and Andrews needs to abort the drop, you'll need his cooperation. She smiled at Dunworthy. We'll discuss it when you come, and when you're here I want you to have an inoculation. I thought you were waiting for the analog. I was, but I'm not satisfied with the way the primary cases are responding to Atlanta's recommended course of treatment. A few of them are showing a slight improvement, but battery is worse if anything. I want all high-risk people to have T-cell enhancement.